The car barreled toward Emily, its tires screeching against asphalt. She didn't turn, couldn't hear the danger approaching, her small hands still arranging wildflowers in the spring grass. Not a single person on the quiet suburban street could reach her in time. Then a blur of tan and black erupted from the porch. Ranger, his powerful body launching across the yard, ears flattened against his scarred head. Margaret dropped her gardening trowel, dirt-covered hands flying to her mouth as a scream caught in her throat. The neighbor across the street froze mid-stride, grocery bags tumbling forgotten to the sidewalk. 3 months ago, this German shepherd had cowered in the corner of a shelter cage, trembling and forgotten. 3 months before that, he'd worn a military vest in Afghanistan. Now, in this breathless moment between life and death, only one question remained. Could a broken soldier save a little girl who lived in silence? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Richardson hadn't expected to become a mother again at 64. The arthritis in her knuckles reminded her each morning that she was meant to be enjoying retirement, perhaps traveling in the modest RV she and Robert had dreamed about before cancer took him. Instead, she found herself packing lunch boxes and attending parent-teacher conferences for her 8-year-old granddaughter, Emily. Their modest 2-bedroom home in Springfield sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. The American flag that Margaret faithfully hung each morning fluttered in the spring breeze, its pole secured to the porch column her late husband had reinforced decades ago. Inside, laminated flashcards with sign language illustrations were taped to everyday objects: refrigerator, lamp, door, evidence of the silent language that connected grandmother and granddaughter. Margaret's Social Security check and Thomas's military survivor benefits stretched only so far. She'd taken up alterations work, her skilled hands mending torn seams and replacing buttons while Emily slept. The child's medical expenses and special education needs left little room for extras, but Margaret made sure Emily never felt the constraints of their budget. "We've got each other," she often signed to Emily, "and that makes us rich as Rockefellers." Emily Richardson had her father's determined jaw and her mother's expressive blue eyes. Born deaf after complications during birth, she'd never heard the sound of her father's voice before he deployed to Iraq for the last time. Captain Thomas Richardson had learned basic sign language during his brief leaves, determined to communicate with his daughter without interpreters. Margaret still kept the worn ASL handbook he'd carried in his rucksack, its pages dog-eared and annotated in his precise handwriting. After losing both parents, Thomas to an IED and Sarah to aggressive breast cancer 2 years later, Emily had retreated into herself. The lively baby who once signed constantly became a withdrawn child who communicated only when necessary. Her world had narrowed to the silent exchanges with her grandmother and the picture she drew of a family that existed now only in photographs. The local elementary school provided an interpreter, but Emily remained isolated. Children were kind enough but struggled to bridge the communication gap. Teachers reported that she was bright but disengaged, her potential locked behind barriers of grief and silence. Margaret watched her granddaughter's solitude with a familiar ache. She recognized in Emily the same loneliness she'd felt after Robert's passing, the emptiness of a life suddenly devoid of its most important conversations. But Margaret's generation didn't dwell on hardships, they found solutions, and she was determined to find one for Emily. And she just never expected that solution would have 4 legs, military training, and emotional wounds that mirrored their own. 18 months before the incident with the car, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea cooling between her palms as she studied the school report before her. Emily's teacher had expressed concern about her continued withdrawal, suggesting that a companion might help bring her out of her shell. The school counselor had recommended a service animal, but the waiting lists were years long and the costs prohibitive. "Maybe just a regular pet," the counselor had suggested. Something to care for. It can work wonders. That Saturday morning, Margaret watched Emily push cereal around her bowl, her small shoulders hunched in that now familiar posture of quiet resignation. Making up her mind, Margaret tapped the table to get Emily's attention. "How would you feel about adopting a dog?" she signed. Emily's eyes widened, her hands suddenly animated as she replied, "Really? Our own dog?" It was the most enthusiasm Margaret had seen in months. By afternoon, they were in Margaret's aging Buick, heading toward the Springfield Animal Shelter. As they pulled into the gravel parking lot, Margaret noticed Emily's hands fidgeting in her lap, a sure sign of excitement. The shelter was busier than Margaret expected for a Saturday. Families moved between rows of kennels, children pointing excitedly at barking dogs. The cacophony that Margaret found overwhelming was merely a vibration to Emily, who watched the dog's body language with intense focus. "Welcome to Springfield Shelter," a woman with silver-streaked hair and a volunteer badge reading Nancy greeted them. "Are you looking to adopt today?" "We're hoping to find a companion for my granddaughter," Margaret explained, resting her hand on Emily's shoulder. "She's deaf, and we thought a dog might be good company." Nancy smiled down at Emily. "Well, we have plenty of wonderful dogs looking for homes." "Do you have any particular type in mind?" Margaret began to explain their needs: medium-sized, good temperament, not too energetic for their small yard, while Emily wandered slightly ahead, peering into kennels. Most dogs rushed forward, tails wagging, some barking excitedly. Emily smiled politely at each one, but Margaret could tell none had captured her heart. Then Emily stopped abruptly at the end of the row, where the kennels turned a corner into a less trafficked area. Her small body went still, and Margaret hurried to catch up. In the last kennel, partially obscured by shadows, lay a German shepherd. Unlike the other dogs, he made no move to approach the front of the enclosure. He lay with his head on his paws, amber eyes open but unfocused, as if looking at something far beyond the shelter walls. His coat was dull, and Margaret could see his ribs even from a distance. A jagged scar marked his left ear, and a laminated card on his kennel read simply, "Ranger, male German shepherd, 7 years, special needs." Emily pressed her hand against the chain-link fencing, her face solemn. "Sweetheart, there are plenty of other dogs," Margaret began, but Emily was already signing rapidly. "He's sad, Grandma, so sad. Like me." Nancy had caught up with them, her expression changing when she saw which dog had caught Emily's attention. "Ah, you've found Ranger. Well, he's a special case." "What's his story?" Margaret asked, noting the way Emily remained fixated on the motionless shepherd. Nancy lowered her voice. "He was a military working dog, served in Afghanistan detecting explosives. About 8 months ago, an IED detonated too close to him. He survived, but the blast took his hearing completely. The military discharged him. They said a deaf dog couldn't serve anymore." Margaret felt a chill. "He's deaf?" Nancy nodded. "Completely." "His handler tried to adopt him, but the man got redeployed. Ranger ended up here 3 months ago. Most people want puppies, or at least younger dogs without complications." Emily was signing to Margaret, her movements insistent. "What's wrong with him? Why doesn't he come say hello?" Margaret translated Nancy's explanation, watching Emily's expression transform from concern to recognition, then to fierce determination. "He's like me," Emily signed, her movements deliberate. "He can't hear either." Before Margaret could respond, Emily knelt down to be at eye level with the kennel. She began to sign slow, deliberate movements directed at the German shepherd. "Hello, I'm Emily. I'm deaf too." Margaret started to explain that the dog wouldn't understand sign language, but the words died in her throat. Ranger had lifted his head, his amber eyes now focused directly on Emily's moving hands. "Well, I'll be," Nancy whispered. That's the first time he's shown interest in anyone since he arrived. Emily continued signing simple words: friend, understand, same, and with each gesture, Ranger seemed more alert. Then, with what appeared to be tremendous effort, the dog rose to his feet and approached the front of the kennel. He moved stiffly, favoring his right side, but his gaze never left Emily's hands. When he reached the chain-link fence, Ranger did something that made Nancy gasp. He raised his right paw and pressed it against the fence, directly opposite Emily's small hand. "In all my 15 years working with shelter animals," Nancy said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've never seen anything quite like this." Emily looked up at Margaret, her face illuminated with a joy Margaret hadn't seen since before Thomas died. "Can we take him home? Please, Grandma. He understands me." Margaret felt uncertainty coil in her stomach. A former military dog with trauma, special needs, and who knew what kind of training, it seemed like asking for trouble. But the way Emily was looking at Ranger, and the way the broken dog was responding to her granddaughter's silent communication. "Would it be possible to introduce them properly?" Margaret asked Nancy. "Outside the kennel?" Nancy hesitated. "We normally have a standard meet-and-greet protocol, but Ranger hasn't been receptive to those. He's never shown aggression, quite the opposite. He just shuts down around most people." She studied Emily and Ranger for a moment. "But I think we could make an exception. Let me get approval from the supervisor." While Nancy went to speak with her supervisor, Margaret knelt beside Emily. "Sweetheart, a dog like Ranger might have special challenges. He's been through trauma, and he might have behaviors we don't understand." Emily's hands flew in determined signs. "So have I, Grandma. So have you." "We understand trauma." The simple truth of her granddaughter's statement left Margaret speechless. From the mouths of babes, she thought. 20 minutes later, they sat in a small, fenced outdoor area behind the shelter. Nancy entered first with Ranger on a leash, moving slowly and telegraphing her movements. The German shepherd walked with military precision despite his apparent stiffness, his eyes constantly scanning the environment. When he saw Emily, his posture changed subtly, the rigid vigilance softening just enough to be noticeable. Emily sat cross-legged on the ground, waiting patiently as Nancy led Ranger to a spot about 6 feet away. Following the supervisor's instructions, she didn't approach or reach out, but simply began to sign again. "Hello again, Ranger. I'm Emily." The dog's focus on her hands was absolute. After a moment of watching, he took a step forward, then another, moving toward Emily with cautious dignity. "He's reading her body language," the supervisor, a man named David, explained quietly to Margaret. "Dogs are incredibly attuned to visual cues, especially breeds trained for service work. With his hearing gone, those visual skills have probably intensified." Ranger stopped just short of Emily, his posture alert but not threatening. Emily, showing wisdom beyond her years, kept her movements slow and deliberate as she extended her palm, allowing the dog to sniff her hand. After a long moment, Ranger lowered his head and bumped his nose gently against her fingers. Emily's smile was radiant. "This is unusual," David admitted. "Ranger has shown minimal interest in potential adopters. We were actually discussing some difficult decisions about his future here." Margaret understood the unspoken implication. Dogs with special needs, especially large breeds with military backgrounds, were difficult to place. Resources were limited. Decisions had to be made. "Would you like to know more about his background before you consider adoption?" Nancy asked Margaret. "Yes, I think that would be wise," Margaret replied, watching as Emily now gently stroked Ranger's scarred ear. The dog's eyes half closed in what looked like the first moment of peace he'd had in a long time. Nancy handed Margaret a folder. This is everything the military provided when he was discharged. Service record, medical history, training protocols. It's quite extensive. As Margaret began to read, she realized that the dog sitting so gently with her granddaughter had once been a highly specialized weapon of war. Ranger had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan, had been decorated for service that saved his unit multiple times, and had skills in explosives detection that bordered on uncanny. The medical report detailed not just his hearing loss but other injuries, healed fractures, shrapnel wounds, and suspected PTSD. The final pages contained the military's assessment after his injury. Subject no longer meets operational requirements. Auditory impairment renders previous training protocols ineffective. Recommendation: honorable discharge from service. Just like that, a hero had been discarded when he could no longer serve in the capacity they desired. Margaret looked up from the paperwork to see Emily teaching Ranger a sign, her fingers forming the word friend over and over until the shepherd tilted his head in apparent recognition. "He's 7 years old," David said, following Margaret's gaze. German shepherds typically live to about 13, but with his service history, there could be ongoing health issues. It's a significant commitment. A significant commitment. The same words the hospital social worker had used when discussing Emily's guardianship after Sarah died. As if Margaret could have made any other choice than to take in her son's child. "I should warn you," Nancy added gently, "that dogs with his background sometimes struggle in civilian homes. The training he received was specific, and the trauma he experienced might manifest in ways we can't predict." Margaret watched as Ranger, this damaged warrior, lowered himself to the ground beside Emily with a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of battlefields and loss. Emily's small hand rested on his shoulder, and for a moment Margaret saw not a potentially dangerous military asset, but 2 wounded souls recognizing something in each other that the rest of the world couldn't see. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that we'll take our chances." The drive home from the shelter was tense, the Buick's back seat occupied by a German shepherd who sat rigidly upright, amber eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Emily had insisted on sitting beside him, though Margaret had initially objected. Now, glancing in the rearview mirror, she saw her granddaughter's small hand resting lightly on Ranger's paw, the only point of contact he seemed willing to accept. "The paperwork alone," Margaret muttered to herself, thinking of the stack of forms she'd signed. Liability waivers, medical disclosures, behavioral agreements, and a special addendum for animals with military training. David and Nancy had been thorough, perhaps too thorough, in outlining all the potential issues they might face. "Most military dogs adjust eventually," Nancy had assured her, though the qualifier "most" hung heavy in the air. "Just remember, consistency is key." And patience? Lots of patience. As they turned onto Maple Street, their modest neighborhood came into view. American flags decorated several porches, and children played in front yards under the watchful eyes of parents. Margaret felt a twinge of uncertainty. What would the neighbors think about a military dog with special needs joining their quiet street? Ranger's posture changed as they pulled into the driveway, his ears flattening slightly, body tensing even further. Emily noticed immediately, signing to him with gentle movements. "Home. Safe." "We'll take it slow," Margaret said, parking the car. "Emily, you stay put while I come around to help." But as Margaret opened the back door, Ranger moved with unexpected precision, placing himself between the open door and Emily, a protective stance that took Margaret aback. Not aggressive, but clearly communicating his newfound responsibility toward the child. "Well," Margaret said, recovering, "I suppose you two have already worked out your own understanding." Emily's response was a brilliant smile, her hands signing, "He's my guardian now, Grandma." The first steps into the house were carefully orchestrated. Margaret had prepared a space in the living room with a dog bed Nancy had donated, positioned where Ranger could see both the front door and Emily's bedroom. She'd removed anything that might startle or confuse him, creating a neutral environment as recommended. Ranger entered the house with military caution, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors as he performed what could only be described as a perimeter check. He moved from room to room, Emily following at a respectful distance, until he'd inspected every corner of their modest home. "He's making sure it's safe," Emily signed to Margaret, her expression serious. Margaret nodded, wondering not for the first time what she'd gotten them into. The shepherd completed his inspection and returned to the living room, where he stood uncertainly until Emily patted the dog bed. After a moment's hesitation, he settled onto it, his vigilant gaze never leaving the front door. That night, Margaret lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a large dog in their home, the occasional sigh, the shifting of weight on the new bed. Around midnight, she heard Ranger get up and move down the hallway. Concerned, she slipped out of bed and followed. The shepherd stood outside Emily's room, head cocked as if listening, though Margaret knew he couldn't hear. She watched as he nudged the door open with his nose and peered inside. After apparently satisfying himself that Emily was safe, he lay down in the doorway, positioned so he could see both the child and the approach to her room. Standing in the shadows, Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. In his damaged, disciplined way, Ranger was already fulfilling a promise no one had asked him to make. The first week was a series of careful adjustments. Emily developed a system of signs specifically for Ranger, simple commands and reassurances that the dog seemed to grasp with uncanny quickness. Margaret consulted with Nancy daily by phone, reporting behaviors and receiving guidance. "He won't eat unless Emily is in the room," Margaret reported on day 3. "That's actually common with working dogs who've bonded with a specific handler," Nancy explained. "They prioritize vigilance over self-care. Try establishing a routine where Emily signals that it's safe for him to eat." The strategy worked. By week's end, Ranger would eat when Emily signed "mealtime" and sat nearby. Sleep presented another challenge. Despite the comfortable bed in the living room, Ranger insisted on maintaining his sentry position outside Emily's door. Margaret compromised by moving his bed to the hallway where he could maintain his self-appointed watch. The most difficult hurdle came unexpectedly on Saturday morning. Margaret was making breakfast when the doorbell rang, Mrs. Abernathy from next door, bringing her weekly offering of fresh muffins. The sound Margaret barely registered caused an immediate transformation in Ranger. His body stiffened, hackles rising as he placed himself between the door and Emily, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "It's okay," Margaret said automatically, before remembering he couldn't hear her. Emily, however, moved quickly into his line of sight, her hands forming calming signs. "Friend? Safe? No danger?" The transformation was remarkable. Ranger's posture relaxed incrementally as he focused on Emily's hands, the growl subsiding. By the time Margaret opened the door, he was alert but controlled. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened at the sight of the German shepherd. "My goodness, Margaret. When did you get a dog?" "Just this week," Margaret said, accepting the basket of muffins. "This is Ranger. He's a retired military dog. He's deaf, so please move slowly around him." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened. "A veteran, is he? Well, thank you for your service, Ranger." She addressed the dog directly, with the same respect she showed the retired sergeant who lived on the corner. Word spread quickly after that. By Sunday afternoon, Margaret had fielded 5 phone calls and 3 visits from curious neighbors. Most were supportive, especially those with military connections. A few expressed concerns. "Military dogs are trained to attack, aren't they?" asked Harold Jenkins, the president of their neighborhood association, when he stopped by uninvited. His gaze on Ranger was wary, his body language stiff. I'm not sure our bylaws address this kind of situation. Ranger is a retired explosive detection specialist, Margaret replied firmly, emphasizing the word retired. He's adjusting to civilian life just like any other veteran. Harold seemed unconvinced, his attention fixed on the scar across Ranger's ear. We have children in this neighborhood, Margaret. Safety has to be our priority. Ranger poses no threat to anyone, Margaret insisted, though a small voice in her head whispered that she couldn't be entirely certain. He's under control and supervised at all times. The confrontation ended without resolution, Harold departing with a promise to review the association guidelines. Margaret closed the door, feeling a familiar weight of judgment, the same she'd felt when making decisions for Emily after Sarah's death, when neighbors and even family had questioned whether a woman her age could properly raise a special needs child. That evening, as Emily and Ranger sat together on the living room rug, the girl reading a book, the dog pressed against her side, Margaret made a decision. If this was going to work, they needed professional help from someone who understood both Ranger's military background and his current limitations. Her search led her to Dr. James Wilson, a veterinarian on the outskirts of Springfield who specialized in working dogs. His website mentioned his own military service in Vietnam and his work with K-9 units. More importantly, when Margaret called to explain their situation, he didn't immediately suggest they return Ranger to the shelter. "Bring him in Tuesday morning," Dr. Wilson said, his voice gruff but kind. "I've worked with a few dogs like him. Not easy cases, but not hopeless either." Tuesday's appointment revealed dimensions of Ranger that the shelter assessment hadn't captured. Dr. Wilson, a tall man with silver hair and a pronounced limp, conducted a thorough examination while explaining each step to Emily through Margaret's interpretation. "Military working dogs are elite athletes," he told Emily, as he checked Ranger's joints and muscles. "Ranger here was at the top of his class, according to these records. Weren't you, soldier?" The dog's ears twitched at the familiar address, earning a thoughtful look from the veterinarian. The physical examination confirmed several old injuries: healed fractures in 2 ribs, scar tissue from shrapnel wounds, and the obvious damage to his left ear. "His hearing loss is complete and permanent," Dr. Wilson confirmed, "but his other senses are likely enhanced to compensate." The behavioral assessment that followed was more encouraging than Margaret had dared hope. Dr. Wilson ran Ranger through a series of scenarios designed to test his responses to different stimuli. The shepherd demonstrated remarkable restraint and discernment, showing caution but not aggression when startled. Most impressive was his response to Emily. When Dr. Wilson created a scenario where the child appeared to be threatened, asking his assistant to approach Emily suddenly, Ranger positioned himself between them instantly, his posture communicating clear warning without aggression. "He's chosen her as his person," Dr. Wilson explained afterward, watching as Emily praised Ranger with signs and gentle touches. "It's not uncommon for these dogs to transfer their working bond to a new handler, but this connection is something special." "Is it safe?" Margaret asked directly. "The neighborhood association has concerns." Dr. Wilson's expression hardened slightly. "Safer than half the poorly trained pets in this county. Ranger has thousands of hours of professional training. Yes, he has trauma. Yes, he needs accommodation for his hearing loss. But his discipline and intelligence are intact." He paused, tapping his prosthetic leg visible beneath his khaki shorts. "Some of us come back changed, Mrs. Richardson. Doesn't mean we don't still have purpose." Margaret felt properly chastised. "I just want to be sure we're doing the right thing for everyone involved." Dr. Wilson's expression softened. "You are. That dog has found his new mission in your granddaughter, and from what I can see, she's found something in him too." The veterinarian provided them with a training plan adapted for Ranger's needs, along with his personal phone number for emergencies. "We'll work together on this," he promised. "Weekly sessions to start. I have some experience with sign language modifications for canine commands. Had a client with a deaf border collie last year." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Wilson handed Margaret a certified letter. "This states that Ranger has been evaluated and is suited for service as a companion animal for your granddaughter. It might help with any community concerns." On the drive home, Margaret felt more confident than she had since bringing Ranger home. The professional assessment confirmed what Emily had somehow known instinctively. Beneath the scars and trauma, Ranger was still a dog with extraordinary capabilities and an enormous capacity for devotion. That confidence was tested the very next day when she found an official notice from the Oakwood Neighborhood Association taped to her front door. The letter, signed by Harold Jenkins, cited concerns regarding potentially dangerous animals and requested her attendance at the next association meeting to address compliance with community safety standards. Margaret felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest. The same protective fury that had flared when the school initially resisted accommodations for Emily's needs. "Some battles you choose, others choose you." "Well, Ranger," she said, though he couldn't hear her, "it seems we've got a fight on our hands." The shepherd, sitting at perfect attention beside Emily as she practiced her homework, turned his scarred face toward Margaret. Something in his amber eyes, a steadiness, a readiness, reminded her so forcefully of Thomas in his uniform that her breath caught. Emily looked up, noticing her grandmother's distress. "What's wrong?" she sighed. Margaret considered sugarcoating the situation but decided against it. Emily had endured enough real loss to deserve real truths. "Some neighbors are worried about Ranger," she signed back. "They don't understand him." Emily's face hardened with a determination that mirrored her father's. "Then we'll help them understand," she signed, her movements precise and forceful. "Ranger is family now." Family. The word hung in the air between them, a declaration and a commitment. Margaret looked at the unlikely trio they formed, an aging widow, a deaf child, and a battle-scarred military dog. Not the family any of them had expected, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. "Yes," Margaret agreed, her hands forming the signs with new resolve. "He is family, and we protect our own." The Oakwood Neighborhood Association meeting was held in the community center, a single-story brick building that served as the hub for local events. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in her navy blue church dress and the pearl earrings Robert had given her on their 30th anniversary. Emily sat beside her, wearing her best floral dress, her blonde hair neatly braided. Ranger lay at their feet, wearing a new vest Dr. Wilson had provided that read, "Service Dog in Training," in bold letters. "Remember what we practiced," Margaret signed to Emily as neighbors began filing in. "You don't have to sign if you're nervous. I can speak for both of us." Emily shook her head firmly. "I want to tell them myself," she signed back. "Ranger is my dog." The meeting room filled quickly. Margaret recognized most faces, the Johnsons from 2 doors down, the Millers from across the street, Mrs. Abernathy with her ever-present knitting. Harold Jenkins stood at the front, shuffling papers with an officious air, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. "Item 3 on tonight's agenda," Harold announced after dispensing with routine matters, "concerns a potential violation of our community pet ordinance. Margaret Richardson has recently brought a military working dog into her home at 247 Maple Street. We need to determine if this animal meets our safety standards." Margaret felt rather than heard the low rumble in Ranger's chest as Harold spoke. She placed a calming hand on the shepherd's shoulder, and he instantly stilled, his attention shifting to her touch. "Mrs. Richardson," Harold continued, "would you like to address the association's concerns?" Margaret rose. straightening her shoulders the way she'd seen Robert do before difficult meetings. "Thank you, Harold. I'd first like to introduce Ranger, a retired military service dog who has been honorably discharged after being injured in Afghanistan. He's trained in explosive detection and has saved numerous American lives." She paused, letting this information register. Several of the older residents, veterans themselves, nodded in appreciation. "Ranger is deaf due to injuries sustained in combat," she continued. "He's undergone extensive evaluation by Dr. James Wilson, a specialist in working dogs, who has certified him as an appropriate service animal for my granddaughter, Emily." Harold cleared his throat. "While we certainly appreciate the dog's service record, our concern is the safety of neighborhood children. Military dogs are trained to attack, are they not?" Before Margaret could respond, Emily stood up. The room fell silent as the small girl moved to stand beside Ranger, her hand resting lightly on his back. With her free hand she began to sign, her movements deliberate and clear. Margaret translated. "My name is Emily Richardson. I am 8 years old and I was born deaf. When my dad died in Iraq and then my mom died of cancer, I stopped wanting to talk to anyone. I felt alone even when people were around." Emily's signs grew more animated, her expression intense. "Ranger understands me. He can't hear either, but he watches my hands and knows what I'm saying. He keeps the nightmares away. He makes me feel safe." The room was utterly still as Margaret continued translating. "Ranger would never hurt anyone. He's gentle and smart. He just wants to protect me like he protected soldiers in Afghanistan. Please don't make my grandmother send him away. He's the first friend who understands what it's like to be in a world where everyone else can hear, but you can't." When Margaret finished speaking, there was a long silence. Mrs. Abernathy's knitting needles had gone still in her lap. Even Harold seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, Frank Miller stood up, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke at these meetings. "I'd like to say something, if I may." His voice was rough with emotion. "My unit in Nam had a dog handler. That German shepherd saved our lives more times than I can count. Could smell tripwires we couldn't see, could sense ambushes before we walked into them." He looked directly at Harold. "That dog came home and lived next door to me for 10 years. Gentlest creature you'd ever meet with children, but God help anyone who threatened his family." Frank turned to Emily and Ranger. "Military dogs understand duty and loyalty better than most people. I think we'd be lucky to have one in our neighborhood." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Harold, sensing the shifting mood, adjusted his approach. "Perhaps we could implement a probationary period with certain conditions." "With all due respect," Margaret interrupted, handing him Dr. Wilson's certification, "Ranger has already been professionally evaluated and approved. Our family has complied with every county ordinance regarding service animals. There are no legal grounds for additional restrictions." Harold reviewed the document with a frown. "This isn't an official service dog certification." "No," Margaret acknowledged. "The certification process is lengthy and expensive, but as Dr. Wilson's letter explains, Ranger is in training to support Emily's emotional and psychological needs related to her hearing impairment and family trauma. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that training period is protected." It was a slight stretching of the truth. They hadn't officially entered a service dog training program yet, but Dr. Wilson's letter carefully worded his professional opinion in terms that skirted the legal boundaries. The debate continued for another 20 minutes, but the tide had clearly turned. When the matter finally came to a vote, only Harold and 2 others opposed allowing Ranger to remain without restrictions. The motion to formally welcome the retired military dog to Oakwood passed with a clear majority. As they prepared to leave, several neighbors approached to meet Ranger properly. Emily beamed as she demonstrated how the shepherd responded to her hand signals, showing off the basic commands they'd been practicing. "He's a credit to his training," Frank Miller said, offering his hand for Ranger to sniff. "You got yourself a fine guardian there, young lady." Only Harold kept his distance, his expression unreadable as he watched the impromptu demonstration. When Margaret approached him afterward, he simply said, "I hope your confidence isn't misplaced, Margaret," before turning away. The neighborhood hurdle cleared, Margaret faced their next challenge, Emily's school. The principal, Mrs. Winters, was sympathetic but firm when Margaret requested permission for Ranger to accompany Emily. "I understand your granddaughter has formed a bond with the dog," Mrs. Winters said during their meeting, "but we have protocols for service animals, and Ranger doesn't yet have official certification." "Emily's psychologist believes Ranger provides significant emotional support," Margaret countered, presenting a letter Dr. Wilson had helped them obtain. "Her withdrawal has decreased dramatically since his arrival." Mrs. Winters reviewed the letter with a practiced eye. "This is compelling, but there are liability issues to consider. What if another child startles him? What if he becomes overwhelmed in the classroom environment?" "Dr. Wilson has evaluated his temperament specifically for these situations," Margaret replied, "and we're working with a trainer who specializes in service dogs for hearing impairment. Ranger has already demonstrated exceptional control and focus." The principal remained hesitant. "Let me consult with the district's legal department. In the meantime, perhaps we could arrange a controlled introduction, bring Ranger in after hours to familiarize him with the school environment." It wasn't the answer Margaret had hoped for, but it was a beginning. The after-hours visit was scheduled for the following week, with Emily's interpreter, Mrs. Santos, agreeing to stay late to facilitate. While they waited for the school's decision, life with Ranger settled into a rhythm. Each morning, Emily would wake and immediately sign, "Good morning," to the shepherd waiting outside her door. They would go through a series of commands Dr. Wilson had designed, reinforcing Ranger's response to visual cues. Margaret watched their bond strengthen daily. Emily, who had once been reluctant to engage with other children, now proudly demonstrated Ranger's abilities to neighborhood kids who stopped by their fence. The shepherd, for his part, seemed to grow more confident in his new role, his posture relaxing incrementally as the days passed without threats materializing. There were still difficult moments. Thunderstorms sent Ranger into high alert, his body rigid as he positioned himself protectively near Emily. The sound of car backfires or fireworks, though inaudible to him, seemed to trigger something in his memory. And he would pace restlessly until Emily calmed him with her gentle hands. And twice, Margaret woke to find Ranger in the throes of what could only be described as nightmares. His legs twitching as if running, soft whimpers escaping his throat. On those nights, she would sit beside him until he settled, her hand resting lightly on his side, wondering what battlefield horrors revisited him in sleep. Dr. Wilson's weekly sessions proved invaluable. The veterinarian worked patiently with Emily and Ranger, teaching the girl more sophisticated commands and helping the shepherd adjust to civilian stimuli. "He's making remarkable progress," Dr. Wilson told Margaret during their fourth session. "Military dogs are trained to be hyper-vigilant, to react to the slightest anomaly. Ranger is learning to distinguish between actual threats and normal civilian activities." "What about his hearing loss?" Margaret asked. "Will that always limit him?" Dr. Wilson's expression grew thoughtful. "In some ways, yes, but in others, it might actually help his transition. Military dogs are trained to respond to both verbal commands and hand signals. With verbal commands removed from the equation, Ranger has fully redirected his focus to visual cues. Emily's sign language provides a natural bridge. The veterinarian demonstrated by having Emily sign a series of commands from across the room: sit, stay, come, down. Ranger responded to each with precision, his attention completely focused on her hands. "It's quite extraordinary," Dr. Wilson admitted. "I've worked with deaf dogs before, but the way he's adapted to reading her signs, it's as if they've developed their own language." "That's what worries the school," Margaret sighed. "They're concerned no one else could control him if necessary." Dr. Wilson considered this. "Let's work on some universal emergency commands, signs that you and the school staff could use if needed." He demonstrated a clear, simple hand gesture. "This means stop everything and lie down. It's based on the military hand signal for take cover." Over the next hour, they practiced emergency commands until both Margaret and Emily could execute them consistently, and Ranger responded immediately regardless of who gave the signal. "Document all of this," Dr. Wilson advised. "Video record his responses to different handlers using these commands. It will strengthen your case with the school." The school visit itself went better than Margaret had dared hope. Ranger walked calmly through the empty hallways, following Emily's lead, his attention divided between his surroundings and the child. When they entered her classroom, he performed a brief perimeter check before settling beside her desk, positioning himself where he could observe both Emily and the door. Mrs. Santos, who had initially seemed nervous about the large shepherd, was won over by his disciplined behavior. "I've never seen Emily so present," she confided to Margaret as they watched the girl showing Ranger around the room. "Usually she's withdrawn, barely participating unless directly engaged. Look at her now." Indeed, Emily was animated, her signs flowing as she introduced Ranger to her classroom environment, showing him her desk, her artwork on the wall, the special light system that alerted deaf students to class transitions. Mrs. Winters observed the entire visit, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. At the end, she seemed less resistant, though still cautious. "Let me review everything with our district's council. I'll have an answer for you by Friday." Friday's answer was a carefully crafted compromise. Ranger would be allowed to accompany Emily 3 days a week initially, with a staff member trained in the emergency commands present at all times. After a 1-month trial period, they would reassess for full-time attendance. "It's a start," Margaret told Emily, who had hoped for daily permission. "We need to show them how well Ranger behaves in the school environment." Emily nodded, though her disappointment was evident. 3 days is better than no days," she signed pragmatically. Ranger's first official day at Oakwood Elementary created quite a stir. Children and teachers alike stopped to watch as the German Shepherd walked precisely at Emily's side, his service vest prominently displaying his working status. Margaret had worried about overstimulation, but Ranger remained focused, his training evident in his calm demeanor despite the novel environment. The classroom introduction had been carefully planned. Mrs. Santos explained to the other students that Ranger was a specially trained dog who helped Emily just as Emily's interpreter helped her communicate. The children were taught a simple rule: ask permission before approaching Ranger and always let him see your hands. By lunchtime, the initial excitement had settled. Ranger lay quietly beside Emily's desk during lessons, rose when she did for classroom transitions, and accompanied her to the cafeteria where he settled under her table without attempting to beg for food. "A perfect gentleman," Mrs. Santos reported when Margaret arrived for pickup. "The other children are already adjusting to his presence." The real breakthrough came during afternoon recess the following week. Margaret received a call from Mrs. Winters, her heart immediately racing at the school's number on her caller ID. "Mrs. Richardson," the principal began, "I wanted to personally call you about an incident today." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Is Emily all right? Did Ranger—" "Emily is fine," Mrs. Winters assured her quickly. In fact, what happened was quite remarkable. During recess, a group of 5th-grade boys were playing rather roughly near where Emily was sitting. One boy was pushed and fell directly toward her. Margaret held her breath, fearing what came next. Ranger moved between Emily and the falling boy, Mrs. Winters continued, but instead of becoming aggressive, he simply created a barrier with his body. He didn't growl or bark, just positioned himself to prevent Emily from being knocked over. Relief flooded through Margaret. That's consistent with his training. He's protective but controlled. Yes, we could see that, Mrs. Winters agreed, but what happened next was even more interesting. The boy apologized to Emily, and she began teaching him some basic signs. Before long, half the class was gathered around as Emily gave an impromptu sign language lesson. Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. Emily, her withdrawn, isolated granddaughter, voluntarily engaging with classmates. Mrs. Santos said she's never seen Emily so socially engaged, the principal continued. It seems Ranger has become a bridge between Emily and her peers. The children are curious about him, which leads to interaction with Emily, which then opens the door to understanding her world. By the end of the trial month, the school board unanimously approved Ranger's full-time attendance. Emily's teacher reported significant improvements in her classroom participation and social integration. For the first time since coming to live with Margaret, Emily had been invited to a classmate's birthday party. At home, the changes were equally profound. The nightmares that had plagued Emily since her parents' deaths decreased dramatically. Where she had once woken crying 3 or 4 nights a week, she now slept peacefully most nights, Ranger's vigilant presence outside her door seemingly enough to keep the darker dreams at bay. Margaret, too, found unexpected comfort in their new routine. Having Ranger in the house provided a sense of security she hadn't realized she was missing. Each night before bed, the shepherd would make a careful circuit of the house, checking doors and windows in a pattern that reminded Margaret of how Robert used to do a final security check before turning in. "You'd have liked him, Robert," she whispered one night, watching Ranger complete his inspection. "He takes care of our girls." 6 months after Ranger joined their family, Margaret received a letter that changed everything once again. The official military envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, its contents bearing the Department of Defense letterhead and a colonel's signature. "We are writing regarding military working dog Ranger, IDK 435-7, formerly attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment," the letter began. "It has come to our attention that this animal is currently in your possession. Due to an administrative oversight, this dog was incorrectly processed for civilian adoption." Margaret's blood ran cold as she continued reading. "Ranger has been selected for inclusion in a specialized study of combat-affected working dogs. As he remains classified as military property, we are hereby issuing a formal request for his return to military custody. A representative will contact you within 30 days to arrange transfer." The letter concluded with formal language about patriotic duty and legal obligations, but the message was clear. They wanted Ranger back. And according to the paperwork, they had the right to take him. Margaret sat heavily at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. How could she possibly tell Emily? After 6 months of healing and progress, how could she explain that the government could reclaim Ranger like a borrowed lawnmower? Across the room, the shepherd himself lay watching her, his amber eyes somehow knowing. Even deaf, he seemed to sense her distress, rising to pad across the floor and rest his head on her knee. "Oh, Ranger," Margaret whispered, her hand automatically finding the scarred ear he liked to have scratched. "What are we going to do?" The dog had no answer, but his steady presence grounded her. Margaret took a deep breath, considering their options. They could fight this, but how? What legal standing did they have against the United States military? She thought of Emily, finally emerging from her shell of grief, of Ranger, finding purpose after being discarded, of the 3 of them, creating a family from the broken pieces of their lives. "No," Margaret said aloud, her voice firming with resolve. "They can't have you back, not without a fight." The shepherd's tail gave a single thump against the floor as if in agreement. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The first person Margaret called after receiving the military's letter was Dr. Wilson. The veterinarian listened silently as she explained the situation, his breathing the only indication he remained on the line. "They can't just take him back," Margaret insisted, her voice cracking despite her efforts to remain composed. "He's not a piece of equipment." "Legally, that's exactly what he is," Dr. Wilson replied, his tone grave. "Military working dogs are classified as equipment under federal law. It's an outdated designation that many of us have fought to change, but it's still the legal reality." Margaret felt the weight of helplessness pressing on her chest. "There must be something we can do. Emily, this would devastate her." Dr. Wilson was quiet for a moment. "Bring the letter to my office tomorrow. Let me make some calls. I still have contacts from my service days who might offer insights." The next challenge was even more daunting. Telling Emily. Margaret waited until after dinner when they were sitting together in the living room. Emily was reading, her hand absently stroking Ranger's head beside her on the couch, an image of contentment Margaret hated to shatter. "Emily," she signed, waiting until her granddaughter looked up, "we need to talk about something important." The girl's expression immediately grew serious, her hand stilling on Ranger's fur. Margaret explained as gently as possible, simplifying the military's bureaucratic language while ensuring Emily understood the gravity of the situation. "They want to take Ranger away?" Emily signed, her movements becoming sharp with distress. "They can't do that. He's ours now." "The military believes they still own him," Margaret explained, her own hands unsteady as she signed. "We're going to fight to keep him, but I needed you to know what's happening." Emily's face crumpled, tears welling in her blue eyes. She wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck, burying her face in his fur. The shepherd responded immediately, pressing closer to her, his amber eyes fixed on Margaret with an almost human question in their depths. "We won't let them take you," Emily signed fiercely, when she finally looked up. "You saved me. Now I'll save you." Margaret felt tears threatening her own composure. How many losses could one child endure? First her father to war, then her mother to illness, and now the companion who had finally helped her begin to heal. "We'll do everything we can," Margaret promised, sitting beside Emily and enveloping both girl and dog in her embrace. "Dr. Wilson is helping us, and we'll find a lawyer if we need to." That night, for the first time since his arrival, Ranger abandoned his post outside Emily's door. Margaret found him curled on the bed beside her granddaughter, his large frame somehow fitting perfectly in the space Emily had made for him. She should have enforced the no dogs on furniture rule, but the sight of them together, Emily's tear-stained face peaceful in sleep, one arm thrown protectively across Ranger's back, stopped the words in her throat. Dr. Wilson's office was busier than usual the next morning. Margaret recognized several veterans in the waiting room, men who nodded to her with the quiet acknowledgement of shared purpose. The veterinarian ushered her into his office immediately, where a tall, distinguished man in civilian clothes waited. "Margaret, this is Richard Taylor," Dr. Wilson introduced. "Former JAG officer, now specializing in military law. He's agreed to consult on Ranger's case." Richard shook her hand firmly. James explained the situation. "I'd like to see the letter, if I may." Margaret handed over the document, watching anxiously as the lawyer read it with an expressionless face. When he finished, he looked up with a slight frown. "This is unusual," he said. "Military working dogs are typically retired when they can no longer perform their duties. Ranger's hearing loss should have made him a clear candidate for civilian adoption." "That's what we thought," Margaret agreed. The shelter had all the proper discharge paperwork. Richard studied the letter again. "They mention a study of combat-affected working dogs. That's not standard procedure. Usually, when the military reclaims a dog, it's because they believe it can still serve its original purpose. Ranger can't hear, Dr. Wilson pointed out. His detection capabilities are compromised. Unless, Richard's frown deepened. There have been rumors about a program studying dogs with unusual sensory development after combat injuries. The theory is that when one sense is damaged, others might become enhanced to compensate. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. Like blind people developing more acute hearing? Exactly. Some handlers have reported that their dogs developed almost uncanny abilities after injuries, sensing things other dogs couldn't, detecting threats through means that couldn't be explained by standard training. Margaret thought of how Ranger always seemed to know when Emily needed him, despite being unable to hear her movements. How he responded to her emotional states without auditory cues. "What are our options?" she asked, bringing them back to the immediate concern. Richard laid out their limited choices. They could comply with the military's request, surrendering Ranger when the representative arrived. They could attempt to negotiate terms, perhaps visiting rights or a delayed transfer, or they could fight the order through legal channels, challenging the military's classification of Ranger as equipment rather than a living being with established bonds. "I should warn you," Richard added, "challenging the military directly is an uphill battle. The courts generally defer to military authority in matters concerning their assets." "He's not an asset," Margaret said firmly. "He's a family member and a service animal for my granddaughter, who has disabilities protected under federal law." Richard nodded. "That's actually our strongest argument. The Americans with Disabilities Act provides significant protections. If we can establish that Ranger functions as a service animal for Emily, we could argue that removing him would constitute harm to a disabled civilian." "He does," Dr. Wilson confirmed. "I've been documenting his support functions for Emily's hearing impairment and emotional trauma. We don't have official certification yet, but the training and bond are real." "Good," Richard said. "Gather every piece of documentation you have. Medical records showing Emily's improvement since Ranger's arrival, school reports, training logs, anything that demonstrates his service role." "And in the meantime?" Margaret asked. "In the meantime, we prepare for their representative to make contact. When they do, be respectful but firm. Don't surrender Ranger voluntarily. Request formal proceedings and time to secure legal representation." As they left the office, Dr. Wilson placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "One more thing," he said quietly. "The community needs to know about this. Public opinion can be powerful in these situations." Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to make a spectacle of our family troubles." "It's not about spectacle," Dr. Wilson insisted. "It's about showing the real impact of treating service animals as disposable equipment. Emily and Ranger have a story that needs to be told." The first contact from the military came sooner than expected. Just 3 days after receiving the letter, Margaret opened her front door to find a man in uniform standing on her porch. His bearing was unmistakably military, spine straight, shoulders squared, expression professionally neutral. "Mrs.?" "Oh, Richardson. I'm Colonel Michael Bennett, United States Army. I'm here regarding military working dog Ranger." Margaret felt her heart rate accelerate but kept her voice steady. "Yes, Colonel. We received the letter. Please come in." She led him to the living room, grateful that Emily was still at school. Ranger, however, was present, and his reaction to the uniformed visitor was immediate and startling. The shepherd, who had been resting on his bed in the corner, rose to full attention, his posture shifting to a formal alertness Margaret had never seen before. Colonel Bennett noticed too. "At ease, soldier," he said automatically, then gave a small, surprised smile when Ranger immediately relaxed his stance, though his attention remained fixed on the visitor. "He still responds to command presence," Bennett observed. "That's remarkable given his hearing loss." "Ranger responds to many visual cues," Margaret said, indicating for the colonel to take a seat. "He's highly intelligent and adaptable. Bennett nodded, studying the shepherd with professional interest. That's partly why I'm here, Mrs. Richardson. Ranger's adaptability makes him valuable to our research program. Research program? Margaret echoed, remembering Richard's warning. The letter was vague about details. The colonel hesitated, seeming to weigh his words. I can't share classified information, but I can tell you that we're studying how combat-injured dogs compensate for their disabilities. The findings could help us develop better training protocols for all working dogs. And this requires removing Ranger from his home, from my granddaughter, who depends on him. Bennett's expression softened slightly. I understand this is difficult, but Ranger remains military property, and his unique capabilities could benefit many service members. He's not property, Margaret said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. He's a living being who has formed profound bonds here. My granddaughter is deaf, Colonel. Ranger has become her bridge to the world. I sympathize with your situation, Bennett replied, though his professional demeanor remained intact. However, my orders are clear. I'm here to arrange Ranger's transfer back to military custody. Margaret took a deep breath. With all due respect, Colonel, we intend to challenge this order. Ranger functions as a service animal for my disabled granddaughter. Removing him would cause significant harm to a child who has already lost both parents. Bennett's eyebrows rose slightly. You're refusing the order? I'm requesting formal proceedings and time to secure legal representation, Margaret replied, using Richard's exact phrasing. As American citizens, we have the right to due process before the government removes a service animal from a disabled child. The colonel studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Very well. I'll report your position to my superiors. Expect formal notification of proceedings within 2 weeks. He stood to leave, then paused, looking at Ranger. He was an exceptional working dog, Mrs. Richardson, one of our best. He still is exceptional, Margaret replied. Just in a different role now. After the colonel left, Margaret sank onto the couch, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush that left her trembling. Ranger padded over immediately, resting his head on her knee in what had become his signature gesture of comfort. What are they doing to us, Ranger? She whispered, stroking his head. Haven't we all given enough to this country already? The story spread quickly through Oakwood. Margaret hadn't intended to publicize their situation, but after Emily's teacher noticed the girl's distress and gently inquired, the news took on a life of its own. Parents talked at school pickup, veterans discussed it at the VFW hall, and soon the local newspaper caught wind of the developing controversy. Local military dog may be reclaimed from deaf child, read the headline of the Springfield Daily News. The article was surprisingly balanced, outlining both the military's legal right to reclaim working dogs and the human impact of separating Ranger from Emily. A photograph accompanied the piece. Emily signing to Ranger in their backyard, the shepherd's attention completely focused on her hands. The community's response was swift and largely supportive. Margaret's phone began ringing with offers of help. The school principal called to express the district's willingness to provide documentation of Ranger's positive impact on Emily's education. Veterans offered to speak on their behalf about the importance of military dogs being properly honored in retirement. Even Harold Jenkins made a surprising appearance at their door, his usual officiousness replaced by awkward concern. "I've been thinking," he said, standing stiffly on their porch. "The neighborhood association could pass a resolution supporting your efforts to keep the dog. It wouldn't have legal standing, but it might demonstrate community sentiment." Margaret was too surprised to respond immediately. Harold cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I may have been overly cautious in my initial assessment of Ranger," he admitted. "He's proven himself to be a well-behaved and valuable member of our community." "Thank you, Harold," Margaret finally managed. "That would be very helpful." Not everyone was supportive. Some community members expressed the view that if the military needs the dog back, it's our patriotic duty to comply. A small but vocal contingent worried about setting precedent for civilians to challenge military authority. Online comments on the newspaper article ranged from deeply sympathetic to harshly critical. "She's exploiting her granddaughter's disability to keep government property," one comment read. "It's anonymity allowing for cruelty without consequence." Margaret tried to shield Emily from the more hurtful reactions, but in the age of social media, complete protection was impossible. When Emily came home from school in tears after a classmate had told her, "The Army is going to take Ranger because he belongs to them, not you," Margaret realized they needed to address the situation more directly. That evening, they sat down together at the kitchen table, Ranger at Emily's side as always. "Some people believe Ranger should go back to the military," Margaret signed honestly. "They think that's the right thing to do because he was trained to help soldiers." Emily's hands flew in response. "But he helps me now." "The soldiers didn't want him anymore after he got hurt." "That's true," Margaret acknowledged, "and many people agree with us, but we need to be prepared for different opinions and for the possibility that we might not win this fight." Emily's face crumpled, but she straightened her shoulders in a gesture so reminiscent of her father that Margaret's heart ached. "We will win," she signed with fierce determination. "Ranger belongs with us now." The formal notification arrived exactly 2 weeks after Colonel Bennett's visit as promised. A hearing was scheduled at the federal courthouse in Springfield for the following month. The military would present its case for reclaiming Ranger, and the Richardson family would have the opportunity to contest the order. Richard Taylor agreed to represent them pro bono, his interest in the case growing as he researched similar situations. "There's actually very little precedent for this specific circumstance," he explained during a meeting at his office. "Military working dogs are typically retired when they can no longer perform their original duties. The fact that they want Ranger specifically, despite his hearing loss, suggests there's more to this story." "Does that help our case?" Margaret asked. "Potentially. If we can demonstrate that their interest is in experimentation rather than standard military necessity, we might gain sympathy from the judge." As the hearing date approached, media interest intensified. A reporter from a national newspaper contacted Margaret, requesting an interview with the family. After consulting with Richard, who advised that positive publicity could only help their cause, Margaret cautiously agreed. The reporter, a thoughtful woman named Susan Carlyle, spent an afternoon observing Emily and Ranger together. She watched their silent communication, the subtle ways they anticipated each other's needs, and the obvious bond between them. "I've covered a lot of human interest stories," Susan told Margaret as she prepared to leave, "but I've rarely seen a connection like theirs. It's as if they speak a language no one else can hear." "That's exactly it," Margaret agreed, watching Emily and Ranger in the backyard, the shepherd attentively following the girls' signing instructions in a game they had invented. "They both live in a world without sound, but they've found a way to connect that goes beyond words." The article appeared 3 days later, accompanied by a powerful photograph of Emily sleeping peacefully with her arm around Ranger, who lay alert beside her bed. The headline read, "The Silent Bond: How a Deaf Military Dog Found His Voice with a Deaf Child." Susan's writing was evocative and powerful, contrasting Ranger's battlefield service with his current role as Emily's companion and protector. She described how the shepherd had adapted his military training to civilian life, using his skills to navigate a world without sound alongside a child facing the same challenges. The article didn't shy away from the legal complexities, presenting the military's position fairly while emphasizing the human cost of enforcement. A sidebar outlined the historical classification of military working dogs as equipment and the recent efforts to reform these designations. Public response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. The local courthouse received so many calls that they had to issue a statement clarifying that public opinion could not directly influence judicial proceedings. Veterans groups across the country issued statements supporting Ranger's right to an honorable retirement with his adopted family. Even national politicians began weighing in, with a senator from a neighboring state publicly questioning whether the military's policy on working dogs needed congressional review. "When we ask dogs to serve alongside our troops, we owe them more than classification as equipment," she stated during a press conference. "We owe them the dignity of proper retirement and care." The day before the scheduled hearing, Colonel Bennett made an unexpected visit to Margaret's home. This time he was accompanied by another officer, a younger man with captain's bars and a medical insignia. "Mrs. Richardson," Bennett began after introductions, "this is Captain Roberts from our Veterinary Corps. Before tomorrow's proceedings, we wanted to conduct a brief evaluation of Ranger's current condition." Margaret hesitated, remembering Richard's advice to allow no military access to Ranger without legal representation present. "I'm sorry, Colonel, but our attorney advised against any examinations without his presence." Bennett nodded as if he'd expected this response. "I understand your caution, but I want to assure you that our primary concern is Ranger's welfare. Captain Roberts is simply here to observe his adaptation to civilian life and his relationship with your granddaughter." "Then you can observe them together at tomorrow's hearing," Margaret replied firmly. "I'm sorry, but we'll follow our attorney's guidance on this matter." The colonel seemed about to argue further when Emily appeared in the doorway, Ranger at her side. The shepherd's posture changed subtly at the sight of the uniforms, not tense but alert in a way that spoke of his training. Emily studied the visitors, then looked questioningly at Margaret. "These men are from the military," Margaret signed. "They're here about Ranger." Emily's expression hardened with a determination beyond her years. She stepped forward, positioning herself beside Ranger, one hand resting protectively on his back. With her free hand, she signed a single, defiant question. "Are you here to take him away?" Margaret translated, watching Colonel Bennett's face as he registered the child's direct challenge. Something shifted in the officer's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight furrow of the brow. He knelt down to Emily's level, his movement slow and deliberate. "Not today," he said, waiting for Margaret to translate. "Tomorrow, there will be a meeting where grown-ups will talk about what's best for Ranger. Your grandmother will be there to speak for you and for him." Emily studied him with solemn blue eyes before signing her response. "Ranger saved me. Now it's my turn to save him." When Margaret translated, Captain Roberts exchanged a glance with Colonel Bennett. The younger officer spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but clear. "Colonel, I'd like to note in my preliminary report that the bond between the dog and the child appears significant and well established. Separation would likely cause considerable emotional distress to both." Bennett nodded, rising to his feet. "Noted, Captain." He turned to Margaret. "We'll see you at the courthouse tomorrow, Mrs. Richardson. 10 a.m. sharp." As they turned to leave, Bennett paused on the porch steps. "Your granddaughter reminds me of someone," he said, his voice unexpectedly personal. "I had a sister who was deaf." Same determination in her eyes. Before Margaret could respond, the officers returned to their government vehicle and drove away, leaving her to wonder if they had just glimpsed a human being behind the uniform, and whether that glimpse might make any difference at all. The night before the hearing, Ranger wouldn't settle. Margaret watched from the hallway as the shepherd paced between Emily's bedroom and the front door, his movements precise and alert. It was as if he sensed the battle looming, understood that tomorrow would determine his fate. Emily had gone to bed early at Margaret's suggestion, though sleep had been slow to come. The girl had lain awake for hours, her small hands occasionally signing words of reassurance to Ranger whenever he checked on her. Finally, exhaustion had claimed her, but even in sleep, her face remained troubled. Margaret returned to the kitchen table where she'd spread out the documents Richard had asked her to organize. School reports, Dr. Wilson's evaluations, photographs documenting Emily and Ranger's journey together. In a separate folder lay Thomas's military records and posthumous commendations. Richard had suggested that reminding the court of the family's sacrifices for country might help humanize their case. "Some battles you choose," Margaret murmured to herself, echoing Robert's favorite saying, "Others choose you." She was gathering the papers when a soft whine from the living room caught her attention. Ranger stood by the front window, his posture rigid, ears forward. Margaret joined him, peering out into the darkness. Nothing seemed amiss on their quiet street, yet the shepherd's attention remained fixed on something beyond her perception. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Ranger turned to look at her, and in the dim light his amber eyes seemed to hold a question, or perhaps a warning. Then he returned to Emily's door, resuming his vigilant watch. Sleep eluded Margaret that night. She dozed fitfully in her armchair, awakening frequently to check on Emily and Ranger. Each time she found the shepherd in the same position, seated outside her granddaughter's door, alert and watchful, a silent guardian against threats both known and unknown. Morning arrived with leaden skies and a chill that belied the spring season. Margaret helped Emily dress in her Sunday best, a navy blue dress with white collar, white tights, and the patent leather shoes she usually resisted wearing. For herself, Margaret chose the charcoal gray suit she'd worn to Sarah's funeral, its somber lines lending her an appropriate gravity. Ranger sensed the importance of the day, remaining unusually still as Margaret fastened his service vest and brushed his coat until it gleamed. Only his eyes moved, tracking Emily as she gathered her things, his attention never wavering from the child. Dr. Wilson arrived at 9 as promised, to drive them to the courthouse. The veterinarian had insisted on accompanying them, both for moral support and to testify if needed. He greeted Ranger with professional affection, checking his eyes and gait with practiced hands. "He seems tense," Dr. Wilson observed. "Animals can sense our anxiety." "It's not just our anxiety," Margaret replied. "He knows something is happening. He was restless all night." The federal courthouse in Springfield was an imposing limestone structure, its steps crowded with reporters and supporters who had gathered after reading Susan's article. Margaret was startled by the turnout. At least 50 people held handmade signs with messages like, "Let Ranger stay," and "Military dogs are heroes, not equipment." Several veterans in uniform stood at attention near the entrance, a silent honor guard. As they approached, a ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Cameras turned in their direction, and voices called out encouragement. Margaret instinctively moved closer to Emily, shielding her from the overwhelming attention, while Ranger positioned himself on the child's other side, his body creating a protective barrier. Richard met them at the top of the steps, his presence a calming influence amid the chaos. "Quite a turnout," he observed, ushering them inside. "Public support is strong, but remember, the judge will decide based on law, not sentiment." The courtroom was smaller than Margaret had imagined, its wood-paneled walls lending a solemn atmosphere. Colonel Bennett and a military legal team occupied one table. Richard guided Margaret, Emily, and Dr. Wilson to another. Ranger settled at Emily's feet, his training evident in his perfect stillness despite the unfamiliar environment. Judge Eleanor Harmon, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes, entered and called the unusual hearing to order. "This is a matter concerning the disposition of military property, specifically a working dog designated as K4357, known as Ranger," she began, her tone matter-of-fact. The United States Army seeks return of this asset, while respondents contest the order on humanitarian and disability rights grounds. The military presented its case first. A stern-faced legal officer outlined Ranger's status as government property, his specialized training representing a significant investment of taxpayer funds, and the military's right to recall such assets when needed. He emphasized the importance of the research program, suggesting that Ranger's unique adaptation to hearing loss could help develop protocols for future military working dogs. "Your Honor, this isn't about one family's attachment to a pet," he concluded. "It's about national security and the welfare of our service members who depend on these highly trained animals." Richard's presentation offered a stark contrast. Rather than disputing the military's legal authority, he focused on the human impact of enforcement. He called Dr. Wilson to testify about Ranger's service to Emily, how the shepherd functioned as both emotional support and practical assistance for a deaf child who had experienced profound trauma. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Wilson stated firmly, "separating Ranger from Emily would cause significant psychological harm to both. They've developed a communication system that transcends traditional handler-dog relationships. They quite literally speak the same language." Emily's school principal testified next, describing the transformation in the child's academic performance and social integration since Ranger had begun accompanying her to classes. Before Ranger, Emily was withdrawn, isolated by her disability and grief. Now she's engaged, confident, even helping other students learn basic sign language. Throughout the testimony, Margaret watched the judge's face, searching for clues to her thinking. Judge Harmon maintained a professional neutrality, though her gaze occasionally drifted to Emily and Ranger, observing their silent interaction. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she approached the witness stand with steady determination, though her heart raced beneath her composed exterior. Richard guided her through prepared questions about Emily's history, her parents' deaths, and the profound changes Ranger had brought to their lives. "Mrs. Richardson," Richard asked finally, "what would it mean for your family if Ranger were removed?" Margaret looked directly at Judge Harmon. "Your Honor, my son gave his life for this country in Iraq. My daughter-in-law fought cancer with the same courage. Their daughter, my granddaughter, has faced more loss in 8 years than most people face in a lifetime. Through it all, she's shown incredible resilience, but Ranger has been the key to her healing." She paused, gathering herself. "Emily and Ranger share something none of us can fully understand. A world without sound where they've created their own language. Taking him away wouldn't just be losing a pet. It would be like taking away her voice, her security, her best friend. I'm not sure she could bear another loss." The military's cross-examination was respectful but pointed. Yes, Margaret acknowledged. She understood Ranger legally belonged to the government. Yes, she recognized the importance of military research. No, she had no specialized knowledge of working dog protocols or training. When both sides had presented their cases, Judge Harmon called a brief recess before making her ruling. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Emily knelt beside Ranger, her fingers signing rapid reassurances that the shepherd seemed to understand despite their complexity. "What do you think our chances are?" Margaret asked Richard quietly. The lawyer's expression was carefully neutral. "Judge Harmon has a reputation for strict interpretation of the law, which favors the military's position. But she also has a history of protecting vulnerable parties in cases involving children. It could go either way." When court reconvened, the judge studied her notes for a long moment before addressing the room. "This case presents an unusual intersection of military authority, disability rights, and the welfare of a child. While the law clearly establishes the military's ownership of working dog K4357, The court must also consider whether enforcement of that right creates undue harm to a protected civilian with disabilities. She looked directly at Ranger, who sat attentively beside Emily. Before rendering a decision, I would like to observe the interaction between the child and the dog. Ms. Richardson, she addressed Emily directly, would you and Ranger please approach the bench? Emily looked questioningly at Margaret, who nodded encouragement. The girl rose and walked forward with Ranger at her side, his movements perfectly synchronized with hers. They stopped before the judge's bench, Emily's small figure dwarfed by the imposing furniture. I understand you use sign language to communicate with Ranger, Judge Harmon said, waiting for Margaret to interpret. Would you show me how that works? Emily nodded solemnly. She turned to Ranger and began to sign, her hands forming clear commands: sit, stay, down, come, that the shepherd followed with immediate precision. Then she signed something more complex, a flowing sequence that Margaret recognized as a story Emily had created about a girl and her dog exploring a forest. Ranger watched intently, his head tilting as he followed the narrative. When Emily finished, she signed "Protect," and the shepherd immediately moved to stand between her and the courtroom, his posture alert, but not aggressive. "Thank you, Emily," the judge said, something softening in her expression. "You may return to your seat." Judge Harmon made notes for several minutes while the courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, she looked up, her decision apparently reached. The court finds that while the United States Army retains legal ownership of the animal in question, immediate enforcement of that right would cause significant harm to a disabled minor who has established a service relationship with the dog. Therefore, I am issuing a temporary injunction preventing removal of K4357, known as Ranger, for a period of 6 months. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Margaret reached for Emily's hand, hardly daring to hope. During this period, the judge continued, the Richardson family will work with a certified service dog trainer to formalize Ranger's status. The military may conduct periodic welfare checks but may not remove the dog without further court proceedings. We will reconvene in 6 months to evaluate the situation. She struck her gavel. Court is adjourned. Relief flooded through Margaret. Not complete victory, but a reprieve. 6 months to strengthen their case, to formalize Ranger's service dog status, to prepare Emily if the worst should happen. Colonel Bennett approached them as they gathered their belongings. His expression was unreadable, but he addressed Margaret with unexpected courtesy. The Army will comply with the court's order. Mrs. Richardson, Captain Roberts will serve as our liaison for the welfare checks. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Emily, however, stepped forward, her hand still on Ranger's back, and signed a simple thank you to the colonel. Bennett's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather was a soldier?" he asked, noting the Vietnam veteran's pin Margaret wore on her lapel. "My husband," Margaret corrected, "and my son was a captain with the 3rd Infantry Division. He died in Baghdad in 2018. Something shifted in Bennett's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or reassessment. "I served with the 3rd ID during Operation Iraqi Freedom. What was your son's name?" "Thomas Richardson," Margaret replied. "Captain Thomas Richardson." Bennett went very still. "Richardson," he repeated. "Was he with the 2nd Brigade combat team?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, a strange feeling creeping through her. "He was killed by an IED while on patrol in eastern Baghdad." The colonel's professional demeanor cracked, revealing genuine emotion beneath. "Mrs. Richardson, I knew your son." "We served together during my first deployment. He was an exceptional officer." The unexpected connection momentarily robbed Margaret of speech. Emily, sensing the importance of the exchange, pressed closer to her grandmother's side. "Captain Richardson saved lives," Bennett continued, his voice quieter now. including mine, during an ambush outside Sodder City. I've never forgotten it. Margaret felt tears threatening. In the 7 years since Thomas's death, she'd met several soldiers who had served with him, each encounter both painful and precious, threads connecting her to the man her son had been in his final years. "Thank you for telling me," she managed. "It means a great deal." Bennett nodded, his gaze dropping to Ranger. 6 months, he said, returning to the matter at hand. "We'll be in touch regarding the welfare checks." As they left the courthouse, Margaret felt the weight of the day's emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The temporary victory, the unexpected connection to Thomas, the uncertainty still hanging over their future, it was almost too much to process. Outside, the crowd of supporters cheered as they emerged, many surging forward with congratulations and encouragement. Richard skillfully guided them through the well-wishers to Dr. Wilson's waiting car, shielding Emily from the overwhelming attention. Only when they were safely inside the vehicle did Margaret allow herself a moment of release, a single tear escaping down her cheek. Emily, watching her grandmother with concern, signed a question. "Are you sad, Grandma?" Margaret shook her head, signing back with trembling hands. "No, sweetheart, just full. My heart is very full today." That night, after Emily had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's emotions, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table. Ranger lay nearby, his vigilance undiminished despite the reprieve they'd been granted. The shepherd's amber eyes tracked her movements as she poured herself a small glass of Robert's old bourbon, a ritual she allowed herself only on significant occasions. "2 small victories," she murmured, raising the glass in a silent toast. Ranger's ears perked forward, his head tilting in that particular way that sometimes made Margaret wonder just how complete his deafness really was. There were moments when he seemed to sense things beyond normal canine perception, vibrations perhaps, or subtle changes in air pressure that humans couldn't detect. The hearing had been a temporary reprieve, not a final victory. In 6 months, they would face the military again, and Margaret harbored no illusions about the challenge ahead. The connection to Thomas might have humanized their family to Colonel Bennett, but his duty remained clear. Ranger was still classified as military property, valuable for research that might save soldiers' lives. How did one weigh that against the well-being of a single child? Margaret didn't envy Judge Harmon that calculation. As she sipped the bourbon, warming her from within, Margaret's thoughts turned to practical matters. The court had ordered them to work with a certified service dog trainer, a significant expense they hadn't budgeted for. Her sewing business brought in modest income, but formal service dog training could cost thousands of dollars. She opened her laptop, beginning to research local trainers who might work with Ranger's unique situation. The prices she found confirmed her fears. Most programs started at $5,000 and increased depending on the complexity of the training. Some offered scholarships or payment plans, but even those required substantial down payments. Margaret closed the computer with a sigh. They would find a way, they always did. But the financial reality added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. She was so absorbed in these thoughts that the sharp crack from outside startled her badly. A car backfiring on their quiet street, a sound Ranger couldn't hear but seemed to sense nonetheless. The shepherd was instantly alert, moving swiftly to check Emily's room before returning to patrol the living room windows. "It's all right," Margaret told him uselessly, knowing he couldn't hear her reassurance. "Just a car." Ranger continued his inspection of the house, his training evident in the methodical way he checked each potential entry point. Only when he was satisfied did he return to his post near Emily's door, his body relaxed but vigilant. Watching him, Margaret felt a renewed determination. This wasn't just about keeping a beloved pet. This was about honoring the bond between 2 wounded souls who had found healing in each other. About recognizing that Ranger's value couldn't be measured in military terms, but in the smile that had returned to Emily's face, in the nightmares that no longer plagued her sleep, in the courage she'd found to engage with the world again. "We'll find a way," Margaret promised softly, finishing her bourbon. "Whatever it takes." The next morning brought a new challenge. Ranger refused his breakfast, turning away from the bowl with uncharacteristic disinterest. When he still hadn't eaten by lunchtime, Margaret grew concerned. The shepherd's energy seemed diminished, his movements stiffer than usual. "What's wrong with Ranger?" Emily sighed worriedly as the dog lay on his bed, his usual alertness noticeably absent. "I'm not sure," Margaret replied. "Maybe he's tired from yesterday's excitement." But by evening, Ranger's condition had worsened. He struggled to rise when Emily called him, his rear legs seeming to collapse beneath him. A small whimper escaped him, the first sound of distress Margaret had ever heard from the stoic animal. Emily's face crumpled with fear. "He's sick, Grandma. He needs help." Margaret immediately called Dr. Wilson, who agreed to meet them at his clinic despite the late hour. Loading Ranger into the car proved difficult. The shepherd couldn't manage the jump into the back seat, requiring Margaret to lift him, a straining task for her aging back. The veterinarian's examination was thorough and increasingly grim. Dr. Wilson palpated Ranger's spine and hips, noting the shepherd's pain response with a deepening frown. X-rays followed, revealing what the experienced vet had suspected. "There's a foreign object near his spine," Dr. Wilson explained, pointing to a small white mass on the X-ray. "Looks like shrapnel that migrated from its original position. It's pressing on his spinal cord now, causing inflammation and pain." "Can it be removed?" Margaret asked, conscious of Emily watching them intently, trying to read their lips. Dr. Wilson's expression was grave. "It's a complex surgery. The location is dangerously close to the spinal cord. I'd need to refer you to a specialist, a veterinary surgeon with neurological expertise." "And the cost?" Margaret asked quietly, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be good for this type of specialized surgery. "You're looking at $8,000 to $12,000, depending on complications." The figure struck Margaret like a physical blow. Their entire savings wouldn't cover half that amount. Even with payment plans, the monthly cost would far exceed her income. "What happens if we do nothing?" she asked, already dreading the answer. Dr. Wilson's gaze was compassionate but honest. "The inflammation will worsen. He'll lose function in his hind legs. Eventually, the pain would become unmanageable." Margaret felt the weight of yet another impossible choice settling on her shoulders. Emily watched them with growing distress, sensing the seriousness of the conversation she couldn't fully hear. "What's wrong with Ranger?" she sighed, her small face pinched with worry. "Can Dr. Wilson make him better?" Margaret hesitated, then signed a simplified explanation. "Ranger has something inside him from when he was hurt in the war. It's causing pain now. Dr. Wilson knows a special doctor who can help, but it's very expensive." Emily's response was immediate and heartbreaking in its childish practicality. "We can sell my toys. And my bike. I don't need them." Margaret pulled her granddaughter into a tight embrace, fighting back tears. "That's very generous, sweetheart. But it would take more money than we have." Dr. Wilson provided pain medication to keep Ranger comfortable temporarily. "This will help for now, but it's not a long-term solution," he warned as they prepared to leave. "I'll contact the specialist tomorrow and see if they offer any financial assistance programs." That night, Emily insisted on sleeping on the floor beside Ranger's bed, refusing to leave the shepherd alone in his discomfort. Margaret brought blankets and a pillow, creating a makeshift bed in the living room where Ranger now lay, too uncomfortable to maintain his usual post outside Emily's door. Long after Emily had fallen asleep, her small hand resting on Ranger's fur, Margaret sat watching them in the dim light. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Just when they'd won a temporary legal reprieve, physical reality had intervened with its own inexorable timeline. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret felt truly overwhelmed. The legal battle, Emily's needs, and now Ranger's medical crisis. It was too much for one aging woman to handle alone. Yet handle it she must, for Emily's sake, if nothing else. "What would you do, Robert?" she whispered into the darkness. "What's the right thing here?" No answer came, of course, but as Margaret finally dozed off in her armchair, one thought crystallized with painful clarity. If they couldn't afford the surgery, the kindest option might be to return Ranger to the military, where his medical needs would be covered as valuable government property. The very thought felt like betrayal. But as dawn broke on a new day, Margaret faced the possibility that saving Ranger might mean letting him go. The morning after Ranger's collapse, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to make impossible numbers align with their reality. The veterinary specialist Dr. Wilson had recommended could see Ranger the following week, but required a $1,500 deposit just to schedule the surgery. Even if she liquidated their modest emergency fund and maxed out her only credit card, they would still fall thousands short. Emily had gone to school reluctantly, only agreeing to leave Ranger's side after Margaret promised to stay with him throughout the day. The shepherd lay on his bed now, the pain medication providing temporary relief. His amber eyes followed Margaret's movements with the same steady attention, though she could see the discomfort beneath his stoic exterior. "What am I going to do, Ranger?" she murmured, reaching down to stroke his scarred ear. The dog leaned into her touch, a gesture of trust that made her heart contract painfully. The ringing phone interrupted her calculations. Colonel Bennett's voice on the other end surprised her. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm calling to schedule our first welfare check for Ranger, per the court's order." Margaret glanced at the shepherd, wondering how to explain his sudden decline. "Colonel, there's been a development you should know about. Ranger is ill. Dr. Wilson discovered shrapnel near his spine that's causing inflammation and pain." A pause. "How serious is it?" "Serious enough to require specialized surgery we can't afford," Margaret admitted, swallowing her pride. "The estimate is between $8,000 and $12,000. Another pause, longer this time. "I see. And without surgery?" "Progressive paralysis, pain, and eventually—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I understand." Bennett's voice had lost some of its official crispness. "In light of this information, I'd like to move our welfare check to today, if that's acceptable." "I'll bring Captain Roberts. He has veterinary expertise that might be valuable." Margaret agreed, setting a time that afternoon. As she hung up, she wondered if the military's sudden interest represented opportunity or threat. Would they use Ranger's condition to press their claim that he belonged in military care? Or might they offer assistance that would allow him to stay with Emily? The practical side of Margaret, the part that had managed household budgets through Robert's illness and found ways to provide for Emily on a fixed income, recognized that the military might offer the only realistic solution to Ranger's medical crisis. The emotional side recoiled at the thought of telling Emily they had to surrender her beloved companion, even for his own good. When Colonel Bennett arrived at precisely 1400 hours, military punctuality intact, he was accompanied not only by Captain Roberts, but also by a third officer Margaret didn't recognize, a woman with Lieutenant Colonel insignia and a Medical Corps badge. "Mrs. Richardson, this is Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," Bennett introduced. "She's Chief of Veterinary Services for our working dog program." Margaret led them to the living room where Ranger lay. The shepherd attempted to rise at the sight of uniformed personnel, his training still evident despite his pain, but Colonel Bennett immediately gave a hand signal that Margaret recognized from their previous encounter. "At ease, soldier," he said, the command accompanied by a gesture that allowed Ranger to remain in place. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes knelt beside the dog, her examination gentle but thorough. Captain Roberts joined her, both officers exchanging quiet observations as they assessed Ranger's condition. "Doctor?" "Wilson's diagnosis appears accurate," Hayes finally said, addressing both Margaret and Colonel Bennett. "The X-rays show a metal fragment approximately 3 millimeters in size that has migrated toward the spinal column. It's causing inflammation of the surrounding tissue and pressure on the nerves." "And the prognosis?" Bennett asked. "Without intervention, deterioration will continue. With proper surgical removal and rehabilitation, recovery could be significant, though likely not complete." Margaret felt a flicker of hope at the word recovery, quickly tempered by the reality of their financial situation. "The specialist Dr. Wilson recommended requires a substantial deposit before they'll even schedule surgery," she explained. "We don't have those resources." Colonel Bennett and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes exchanged a glance that contained some unspoken communication. The female officer nodded slightly, and Bennett turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Richardson, given Ranger's condition, I believe it would be in his best interest to return to military custody temporarily for medical treatment. The Army has facilities specifically designed for working dog rehabilitation, with specialists experienced in combat injuries." The moment Margaret had dreaded had arrived. "And after his recovery?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "That would depend on multiple factors," Bennett replied diplomatically. "His response to treatment, the court's ruling, the needs of our program. In other words, once they had Ranger back, they might never return him." Margaret felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. How could she possibly explain this to Emily? As if reading her thoughts, Bennett added, "Of course, you and your granddaughter would have visitation rights during his recovery period. We're not heartless, Mrs. Richardson, despite what some might think. We understand the bond that's formed here." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes spoke up. "If it helps, I can tell you that our rehabilitation program for military working dogs is truly state-of-the-art. Ranger would receive care that few civilian facilities can match, at no cost to your family." Margaret believed her. The sincerity in the officer's voice was unmistakable, her concern for Ranger's welfare evident in her careful examination and gentle handling. "May I have some time to consider?" Margaret asked. "And to prepare my granddaughter? This will be difficult for her to understand." "Of course," Bennett agreed, "but I should note that Ranger's condition will likely worsen with delay. We could have him in surgery within 48 hours at our facility." After the officers left, Margaret sat beside Ranger, her hand resting lightly on his side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The practical decision was clear. The emotional one was impossible. When Emily returned from school, she rushed to Ranger's side, her face falling when she saw his condition hadn't improved. Her hands flew in worried signs, asking if the doctor had called, if there was medicine to make him better. Margaret took a deep breath and began to sign, explaining as gently as possible about the military's visit and their offer to provide medical care. She emphasized the specialized facilities, the experienced doctors, the fact that such care would cost thousands of dollars they simply didn't have. Emily's face crumpled as understanding dawned. "They'll take him away," she signed, her movements sharp with distress. "They won't bring him back." "They've promised we can visit him," Margaret signed back, knowing how hollow the assurance must sound. "And the judge said they can't keep him permanently without another hearing." Emily's response was immediate and fierce. "No! We can find another way. We can raise the money ourselves." The determination in her granddaughter's expression gave Margaret pause. Emily had already lost so much. Both parents, her hearing, the normal childhood she might have had. Could Margaret really take away the one thing that had finally helped her heal? "How would we raise that much money?" Margaret signed gently, trying to guide Emily toward accepting reality. The girl's response surprised her. "We make a video. We tell people about Ranger and me. We ask for help." Margaret was about to explain how unlikely such a plan was to succeed when she remembered the crowd outside the courthouse, the supporters who had rallied around their cause after Susan's article. Perhaps Emily's instinct wasn't as naive as it first appeared. "A fundraiser?" Margaret signed, considering the possibility. Emily nodded emphatically. "People help when they understand. We need to help them understand about Ranger and me." That evening, after Emily had finally fallen asleep beside Ranger's bed, Margaret made 3 phone calls. The first was to Richard Taylor, explaining the situation and asking about the legality of fundraising while their case was pending. The second was to Susan Carlyle, the reporter whose article had generated so much public support. The third was to Dr. Wilson, seeking his medical opinion on whether Ranger could wait another week before treatment. By morning, a plan had begun to take shape. Susan agreed to write a follow-up story highlighting Ranger's medical crisis and the family's financial dilemma. Richard confirmed that fundraising was perfectly legal and offered to help establish a proper trust account for donations. Dr. Wilson, after consulting with colleagues, believed that with proper medication, Ranger could safely wait another 7 to 10 days before his condition would become critical. Most surprisingly, Dr. Wilson also offered to reach out to a network of veterinarians who specialized in working with military dogs. "There's a whole community of vets who feel strongly about supporting these animals after their service," he explained. "Let me see who might be willing to provide services at a reduced rate." Margaret called Colonel Bennett to request a 1-week extension before making their decision about military medical intervention. To her relief, he agreed, though his concern about delay was evident. "1 week, Mrs. Richardson," he said firmly. "After that, Ranger's welfare must take priority over all other considerations." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Susan's follow-up article appeared in Sunday's paper, featuring a powerful photograph of Emily sleeping beside Ranger's bed, her small hand resting protectively on his side. The headline read, "After Court Victory, Military Dog and Deaf Girl Face New Battle." The story detailed Ranger's medical condition, the prohibitive cost of treatment, and the military's offer to reclaim him for care, with the implied risk that he might never return to Emily. Susan included quotes from Dr. Wilson about the shepherd's remarkable bond with Emily and the potential psychological impact of separation. The article ended with information about the trust account Richard had established for donations. That same day, with help from one of Emily's teachers who volunteered her technical skills, they created a simple video. Emily, speaking through sign language with Margaret interpreting, told the story of finding Ranger at the shelter, recognizing their shared experience of deafness and the ways he had helped her emerge from isolation. The video showed clips of their silent communication, the specialized signs Emily had developed for Ranger, and the shepherd's protective behavior around his young charge. "Ranger saved me when I was sad and alone," Emily signed in the video's emotional conclusion. "Now he needs surgery because he was hurt protecting soldiers. Please help us save him." The video was uploaded to social media on Monday morning. By evening, it had been viewed over 10,000 times. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing Dr. Wilson about Ranger's condition and Margaret about their fundraising efforts. Veterans groups shared the video widely, adding their own calls for support. Donations began trickling in immediately. $5 here, $20 there, occasional larger amounts from more affluent supporters. By Tuesday evening, they had raised just over $3,000, an impressive sum in such a short time, but still far short of what they needed. Then came the first breakthrough. Dr. Wilson called Wednesday morning with news that a veterinary surgeon specializing in neurological cases had reached out after seeing their story. Dr. Abigail Chen, who had worked with military dogs before establishing her private practice, offered to perform Ranger's surgery at cost, reducing the price from $10,000 to $4,500. "She's one of the best in the field," Dr. Wilson explained. "She trained with the Veterinary Corps before going private. This is incredibly fortunate, Margaret." The reduced cost brought their goal within reach. With the $3,000 already raised and Dr. Chen's discount, they needed just $1,500 more to cover the surgery. The rehabilitation costs would still present a challenge, but Margaret allowed herself to hope they might actually succeed. The second breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Harold Jenkins, the neighborhood association president who had initially opposed Ranger's presence in Oakwood, appeared at their door Wednesday afternoon. He stood stiffly on the porch, his usual officious manner replaced by something more hesitant. "I've been following your situation in the news," he began awkwardly. "The association held an emergency meeting last night to discuss how we might help." He handed Margaret an envelope. Inside was a check for $2,000, drawn on the Oakwood Neighborhood Association account, and a letter formally declaring Ranger an honored resident of Oakwood in recognition of his military service and his assistance to Emily Richardson. Margaret was momentarily speechless. "Harold, I don't know what to say. This is unexpected." The older man shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, the community felt it was important to support one of our own." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "My son would have been about your age, Margaret. We lost him in '71 in Vietnam. He never came home to have a family of his own." Understanding dawned. Harold's opposition had never been about Ranger specifically. It had been about fear, about the painful memories of loss that the military dog represented. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, recognizing that anything more would embarrass him. Harold nodded once, sharply, and turned to go. He paused at the steps. "We're all pulling for him," he said, not looking back. "For both of them." By Thursday evening, their fundraising total had reached $7,200, enough to cover Dr. Chen's reduced surgical fee and a significant portion of the anticipated rehabilitation costs. Margaret called Colonel Bennett to inform him they would be pursuing civilian treatment, grateful that she could now decline the military's offer without compromising Ranger's care. The colonel's response surprised her. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm glad to hear you've found a solution. However, there's something you should know before you proceed." "What's that?" Margaret asked, wariness creeping into her voice. "Our veterinary corps reviewed Ranger's complete medical history after our visit. We discovered something unusual in his deployment records, something that may be relevant to your situation." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "Ranger wasn't just any military working dog," Bennett explained. "He was deployed with a specific handler for most of his service, a handler whose name you might recognize, Captain Thomas Richardson." The world seemed to stop around Margaret. "Thomas, my son was Ranger's handler?" "Not his primary handler," Bennett clarified quickly, "but they worked together during Captain Richardson's last deployment. Ranger was being cross-trained with multiple handlers in that unit." Margaret sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Why wasn't this in the records the shelter received?" "Military handlers aren't always listed in the dog's civilian discharge papers, just their primary trainer and their final handler before discharge. It was only when we pulled his complete service record that the connection became apparent." Margaret's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. Had Ranger somehow sensed the connection to Thomas when he first met Emily? Was that why he had responded so immediately to her, recognizing something of her father in her? "There's more," Bennett continued. "According to the after-action report from the incident where Captain Richardson was killed, Ranger was with him when the IED detonated. The dog sustained his initial injuries in that same explosion, though he wasn't deafened until a later incident. "Ranger was with Thomas when he died?" Margaret whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, and according to witnesses, the dog refused to leave your son's side until medics arrived, despite his own injuries. He's mentioned specifically in the report for his attempts to alert others to the captain's location." Margaret thought of the shepherd's protective behavior around Emily, his unrelenting vigilance, his refusal to leave her vulnerable even for a moment. Had he been trying, in his own way, to fulfill a promise to the handler he couldn't save? "I thought you should know this before making your final decision," Bennett said. "It may not change anything practically, but it seemed relevant." "Thank you," Margaret managed, her voice thick with emotion. "It changes everything." After hanging up, Margaret sat in silence, tears streaming down her face. How could she tell Emily that Ranger had been with her father in his final moments? That the shepherd they had rescued by chance had once tried to save Thomas's life? Some truths were too heavy for an 8-year-old's shoulders, some connections too profound to be coincidence. When Emily returned from school, Margaret told her only the good news, that they had raised enough money for Ranger's surgery, that Dr. Chen would operate the following week, that they wouldn't have to surrender him to the military after all. Emily's joy was incandescent, her small body launching into Margaret's arms in a rare display of physical exuberance. She knelt beside Ranger immediately afterward, her hands signing the good news in excited movements that the shepherd watched with patient attention despite his discomfort. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Margaret sat beside Ranger, stroking his fur as she whispered the truth he couldn't hear. "You were with him, weren't you? With Thomas at the end." Her voice broke on her son's name. "You tried to save him, just like you're saving his daughter now." The shepherd's amber eyes held hers, infinite patience in their depths. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a shared grief, a recognition of the invisible threads that had brought them together. Margaret had always believed that some battles choose you. Now she understood that some bonds were forged long before you recognized them, connections that transcended time, distance, even death itself. Dr. Chen arrived the following morning to examine Ranger and confirm her surgical plan. She was younger than Margaret had expected, with capable hands and a quiet confidence that inspired trust. "The fragment is in a challenging location," she explained as she reviewed the X-rays with Margaret. "But I've removed similar objects before. The key will be minimizing inflammation around the spinal cord during extraction." She knelt beside Ranger, her examination gentle but thorough. "He's an extraordinary animal," she observed. "The pain must be significant, but he's controlling his response to it." That's typical of these working dogs. They're trained to ignore discomfort that would incapacitate most pets. "When can you perform the surgery?" Margaret asked. "I've cleared my schedule for Monday," Dr. Chen replied. "We'll need to begin pre-operative protocols tomorrow. Limited food, certain medications to reduce inflammation. Dr. Wilson has agreed to assist, which will be tremendously helpful since he already has Ranger's trust." As the veterinarian prepared to leave, Margaret made a decision. "Dr. Chen, there's something you should know about Ranger, something we just discovered." She explained the connection to Thomas, watching the doctor's expression shift from professional interest to deep compassion. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm so sorry for your loss," Dr. Chen said when Margaret finished. "And I'm honored to be part of this story now, to help bring healing to both Ranger and your family." The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Dr. Wilson provided detailed instructions for Ranger's pre-surgical care, which Emily followed with solemn dedication. The fundraising total continued to climb, exceeding their goal and creating a cushion for rehabilitation expenses. On Sunday evening, Margaret received another unexpected visitor. Colonel Bennett arrived alone, out of uniform, his appearance so different in civilian clothes that she almost didn't recognize him. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, standing awkwardly on the porch. "I wanted to check on Ranger before his surgery and to bring something I thought you might want to have." He handed Margaret a small box. Inside was a set of military dog tags. Not Ranger's, but Thomas's. "These were his spare set," Bennett explained. "They were recovered with his personal effects. I thought Emily might want them." A connection to both her father and Ranger. Margaret stared at the metal tags, her son's name and information stamped in the standard military format. "How did you get these?" "I made some inquiries," Bennett said simply. "When commanding officers understand the situation, doors tend to open." Margaret looked up at the colonel, seeing him clearly for the first time not as an adversary, but as a man doing his duty while trying to balance competing obligations. "Would you like to come in? Meet Emily properly?" Bennett hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that very much." Inside, Emily was sitting with Ranger, reading aloud from a book with her hands, signing the story for the shepherd who watched her movements with his customary attention. She looked up as Margaret entered with their visitor, curiosity replacing her initial wariness when Margaret explained who he was. "Colonel Bennett knew your father," Margaret signed, deciding in that moment that some truths could be shared after all. "And he discovered something special about Ranger. Ranger worked with your dad in the Army." Emily's eyes widened, her gaze darting between Margaret, Bennett, and Ranger. "My dad was Ranger's person?" she signed, her movements quick with excitement. Margaret translated for Bennett, who nodded gravely. "Your father was very brave," he said, waiting for Margaret to sign his words. "And Ranger was brave too. They protected other soldiers together." Emily absorbed this information with the solemn consideration Margaret had come to recognize as her processing important revelations. Then she signed a simple question. "Did Ranger love my dad like he loves me?" When Margaret translated, Bennett knelt to Emily's level, his military bearing softening. "I believe he did," he replied, his voice gentle. "Military dogs and their handlers share a special bond. They trust each other completely." Emily nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. She turned to Ranger, signing something too quick for Margaret to catch, her hands moving in the private language she had developed with the shepherd. Whatever she communicated, Ranger responded by pressing closer to her side, his loyalty evident in every line of his body. Colonel Bennett stayed only a short while longer, declining Margaret's offer of coffee but accepting a glass of sweet tea. As he prepared to leave, he addressed Margaret with unexpected candor. "The research program is real," he said quietly. "But after learning about Ranger's connection to Captain Richardson, I've recommended that the military withdraw its claim. Some bonds shouldn't be broken, Mrs. Richardson, even for the greater good." "Thank you," Margaret replied, recognizing the gift he was offering. "That means more than you know." Bennett nodded once, military precision in the gesture. "Good luck with the surgery tomorrow. I'll be following his progress with interest." As Margaret closed the door behind him, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, one battle at least that might be resolved without further conflict. She turned to find Emily watching her, the child's expressive face showing the intuitive understanding that had always seemed beyond her years. "Ranger was trying to find us," Emily signed, her movements deliberate and certain. "Dad sent him to take care of us." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the simple, profound faith in her granddaughter's statement. Who was she to say it wasn't true? In a world where a deaf military dog could find his way to the deaf daughter of his former handler, who could definitively claim that coincidence, not providence, was at work. "Maybe he did, sweetheart," Margaret signed back. "Maybe he did." Monday morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that seemed almost deliberate, as if nature itself acknowledged the importance of the day. Margaret woke early, her dreams filled with fragments of memory. Thomas as a boy, Robert in his uniform, Emily's first signs, Ranger standing vigilant at the door. The past and present intertwined in her sleeping mind, weaving connections she hadn't consciously recognized. Emily had slept beside Ranger again, unwilling to leave him alone before his surgery. Margaret found them both awake, the girl's small hand moving in gentle patterns through the shepherd's fur. Ranger's amber eyes tracked Margaret as she entered, alert despite the pain medication that had kept him comfortable through the night. "Today is the day," Margaret signed to Emily. "Are you ready?" Emily nodded solemnly. "Ranger is ready too," she signed back. "I told him Dr. Chen will make him better, and then he can run again." The drive to Dr. Chen's veterinary surgical center was quiet, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts. Ranger lay in the back seat beside Emily, his head resting on her lap, seemingly content despite the discomfort that was evident in the occasional tensing of his body over bumps in the road. Dr. Wilson met them at the entrance, his familiar presence a comfort as he helped Ranger from the car. The shepherd moved stiffly but with dignity, maintaining his composure even as pain flickered across his expressive face. "Dr. Chen is preparing the surgical suite," Dr. Wilson explained as he led them inside. "We've scheduled 3 hours for the procedure, though it may take less time if the fragment is positioned favorably." The surgical center was state-of-the-art, its clean lines and modern equipment speaking to Dr. Chen's reputation as one of the top veterinary surgeons in the region. A board by the reception desk displayed photos of her success stories, dogs who had recovered from seemingly impossible injuries, many of them working animals like Ranger. Dr. Chen herself appeared a few minutes later, dressed in surgical scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She knelt to greet Ranger at his level, her examination professional but gentle as she checked his vitals one final time. "He's in excellent condition overall," she told Margaret, rising. "That military training and discipline will serve him well during recovery. Working dogs tend to follow rehabilitation protocols better than average pets. They understand the concept of working through discomfort for a greater purpose." The most difficult moment came when they had to say goodbye before the surgery. Emily knelt beside Ranger, her hands forming signs that Margaret recognized as their special language, part standard ASL, part unique gestures they had developed together. "She's telling him to be brave," Dr. Wilson translated quietly, watching the exchange with professional interest. "And that she'll be waiting when he wakes up." Margaret felt tears threatening as Emily pressed her forehead briefly against Ranger's, a gesture of such simple intimacy that it seemed almost sacred. The shepherd remained perfectly still for the contact, his eyes never leaving the child's face. "It's time," Dr. Chen said gently. "We need to begin the anesthesia protocol." Emily stood reluctantly, her hand lingering on Ranger's fur until the last possible moment as Dr. Wilson led him toward the surgical area. At the doorway, the shepherd paused, looking back at Emily with what could only be described as reassurance, as if he were telling her not to worry, that he would return. Then he was gone, following Dr. Wilson, with the same dignified obedience he had shown throughout his military career and beyond. The waiting room became their world for the next 3 hours. Margaret had brought Emily's favorite books, a sketch pad, and snacks, but the girl showed little interest in any distraction. She sat quietly, occasionally signing questions about the surgery, her usual animation subdued by anxiety. "Will it hurt when he wakes up?" she asked, her signs smaller than usual, as if trying to contain her fear within her hands. "Dr. Chen will give him medicine so the pain isn't too bad," Margaret signed back, "and we'll help him get better a little each day, just like you helped me after I hurt my back last year." Emily nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. She returned to watching the clock on the wall, its hands moving with excruciating slowness. Halfway through the scheduled surgical time, Dr. Wilson emerged to provide an update. "Dr. Chen has located the fragment," he reported. It's positioned close to the spinal cord but hasn't caused permanent damage. She's working on extracting it now." The news brought cautious relief. Margaret had feared worse, that they would discover irreparable harm, that Ranger's condition was beyond even Dr. Chen's considerable skills. "How much longer?" Emily signed anxiously. "About another hour," Dr. Wilson replied, his own signing slightly awkward but functional, a skill he had been practicing since meeting them. "Ranger is doing very well. His heart rate is strong and steady." The final hour seemed even longer than the first two. Emily eventually fell asleep against Margaret's shoulder, exhaustion overcoming her determination to remain vigilant. Margaret found herself staring at the same page of her magazine for 20 minutes, unable to focus on the words as her mind conjured all the things that could still go wrong. When Dr. Chen finally appeared in the doorway, still in her surgical gown, Margaret gently woke Emily. The surgeon's face was tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who has completed difficult work successfully. "The surgery went well," she announced, removing her surgical cap. "We extracted a metal fragment approximately 4 millimeters in size from near the spinal column. There was significant inflammation in the surrounding tissue, which explains the increasing pain and mobility issues." She held up a small container, inside which Margaret could see a jagged piece of metal, unremarkable in appearance, impossible to connect visually with the devastation it had caused. This tiny shard had threatened Ranger's mobility, his quality of life, perhaps his very existence with them. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, Emily watching the surgeon's face intently, trying to read the outcome in her expression. "Ranger is in recovery," Dr. Chen explained. "He'll remain here for 48 to 72 hours for observation and initial rehabilitation. The first day is critical. We need to ensure the inflammation doesn't worsen and that he begins to show appropriate neurological responses as the anesthesia wears off." Emily tugged at Margaret's sleeve, her face anxious as she signed, "When can we see him?" After Margaret translated, Dr. Chen's expression softened. "He's still under anesthesia, but you can see him briefly once he's settled in the recovery ward. It's important to understand he won't be very responsive, and he'll have monitoring equipment attached." An hour later, a veterinary technician led them to the recovery area. Ranger lay on a padded bed, an IV line delivering fluids and medication to his foreleg. His surgical site was covered with a sterile dressing, and a monitoring device beeped softly, tracking his heart rate and oxygen levels. Emily approached slowly, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. She didn't attempt to touch Ranger, seeming to understand instinctively that he needed undisturbed rest, but she stood beside his bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, with an intensity that spoke volumes about her attachment. "He looks peaceful," Margaret observed, trying to reassure her granddaughter. "He's dreaming about running," Emily signed in response. "When he wakes up, he'll know we kept our promise." The next 2 days established a new routine. Margaret brought Emily to the surgical center each afternoon after school, where they spent 2 hours in Ranger's recovery room. Dr. Chen had made an exception to the usual visitation rules, recognizing the unique bond between the shepherd and the child. Ranger's progress exceeded expectations. By the second day, he was alert and responsive, though movement clearly caused him discomfort. By the third day, he was able to stand with assistance, his back legs weak but functional. Through it all, his focus on Emily remained unwavering, his amber eyes tracking her movements, his tail offering a gentle wag when she entered the room. "His recovery is remarkable," Dr. Chen told Margaret on the third afternoon. "Working dogs often have an exceptional drive to heal, but Ranger's progress suggests something more, a specific motivation to return to function." "Emily," Margaret said simply. Dr. Chen nodded. "Exactly. He has a mission, and that mission involves being back at her side. It's a powerful motivator for recovery. On the fourth day, Dr. Chen declared Ranger ready to go home, though with strict limitations on his activity and a rigorous rehabilitation schedule. He needs to rebuild strength gradually, she cautioned, as she demonstrated the passive range of motion exercises Margaret would need to perform twice daily. Too much activity too soon could cause setbacks. Emily listened to these instructions with solemn attention, her hands signing questions about specific exercises and timelines. Dr. Chen answered each query with the same seriousness she would show an adult, recognizing the child's role as Ranger's primary caregiver. The most important thing to remember, Dr. Chen concluded, is that Ranger won't always show when he's in pain. Military dogs are trained to work through discomfort. You'll need to watch for subtle signs, changes in breathing, reluctance to move certain ways, alterations in posture. Emily nodded, signing confidently. I know Ranger's signs. I can tell when he hurts. Margaret translated, adding, she's remarkably observant with him. They have their own communication system. The homecoming was quiet but joyful. Ranger walked slowly from the car to the house, his gait steady but cautious, Emily at his side matching her pace to his. Inside, he went directly to his bed in the living room, a behavior so routine it brought tears to Margaret's eyes. After all the drama and uncertainty, the simple normalcy of Ranger returning to his spot felt like a miracle. The rehabilitation process proved both challenging and rewarding. Each morning and evening, Margaret and Emily performed the prescribed exercises, gently stretching Ranger's legs and back, massaging the muscles that had tensed to protect the injured area, gradually increasing the range of motion as healing progressed. Dr. Wilson visited twice weekly to assess Ranger's recovery and adjust their rehabilitation plan. He's regaining strength faster than I anticipated, he remarked during the second week. The nerve function in his hind legs is almost completely normal again. The Shepherd's return to school came a month after surgery. Emily had continued her classes without him, but both child and dog had clearly felt the separation. Their reunion each afternoon had become a ritual. Ranger waiting by the door despite his discomfort, Emily dropping her backpack to kneel beside him the moment she entered. Principal Winters visited personally to assess Ranger's readiness to resume his duties. She watched as Emily guided him through a series of basic commands, noting his steady movement and alert responses. He seems fully recovered, she observed. But is he ready for the stimulation of a school environment? Dr. Chen believes he's ready for normal activity, Margaret replied. He's been cleared for everything except jumping and rough play, which weren't part of his school routine anyway. The principal nodded, her decision apparently made. We've missed him, you know. The other children ask about him constantly. He's become something of a school celebrity since your story went public. Indeed, Ranger's return to Oakwood Elementary was met with a hero's welcome. Students lined the hallway, having been instructed by their teachers on how to greet him appropriately. No sudden movements, no loud noises, each child waiting for permission before offering a gentle pat. Emily walked beside him, her face glowing with pride as she signed introductions. Ranger maintained perfect composure despite the attention, his military training evident in his dignified acceptance of each greeting. As life settled back into its rhythms, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a simple desire to find Emily a companion had evolved into something far more profound. A legal battle, a medical crisis, a community rallying together, and the discovery of connections that defied rational explanation. 6 months after Ranger's surgery, they received a letter from the Department of Defense. Margaret opened it with trepidation, fearing that despite Colonel Bennett's assurances, the military might renew its claim. Instead, she found an official notification that Ranger had been formally discharged from military service with honors. His status changed from equipment to retired military working dog. Accompanying the letter was a ceremonial collar with military insignia and a medal for distinguished service. "They're acknowledging him as a veteran, not property," Margaret explained to Emily as they examined these items together. "This means the military officially recognizes his right to live with us as his forever family." Emily's smile was radiant as she fastened the ceremonial collar around Ranger's neck for a photograph. The shepherd sat at perfect attention, as if recognizing the significance of the moment, his amber eyes steady and clear. The formal ceremony took place on Veterans Day at the community center where they had once defended Ranger's right to remain in their neighborhood. Colonel Bennett presided, now an ally rather than an adversary, his dress uniform adding appropriate gravity to the proceedings. Veterans from across the region attended, forming an honor guard as Ranger walked beside Emily down the center aisle. The shepherd moved with his old fluid grace. All signs of his injury faded, though Dr. Chen had warned that cold weather might always cause some stiffness in his back. "Today we recognize the service and sacrifice of a warrior who has walked in two worlds," Colonel Bennett began, his voice carrying through the packed hall. "Military working dog Ranger served his country with distinction in Afghanistan, saving countless American lives through his courage and skill." Emily stood beside Ranger at the front of the room, her hand resting lightly on his back, Margaret a step behind them both. They had debated whether Emily should speak at the ceremony, and the girl had ultimately decided she wanted to, with Margaret interpreting. "But Ranger's service didn't end when he left the battlefield," Bennett continued. "Like many veterans, he found a new mission, a new purpose that gave meaning to his sacrifice. In Emily Richardson, he found someone who needed his protection, his companionship, his understanding of a world experienced differently." The colonel turned to address Ranger directly, a gesture of respect that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "On behalf of a grateful nation, we present you with the Military Working Dog Service Medal in recognition of your distinguished service both in combat and civilian life." Bennett approached, kneeling to affix the medal to Ranger's ceremonial collar. The shepherd remained perfectly still, his training holding even in this unfamiliar situation, his focus unwavering as the colonel performed the formal pinning. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she stepped forward with quiet confidence. Her hands formed signs that Margaret translated for the audience, her young voice steady and clear. "Ranger and I understand each other because we both live in a world without sound." Margaret spoke Emily's words. "People think that makes things harder for us, but sometimes it makes things clearer. We see what others miss. We feel what others ignore." Emily continued signing, her expressions as eloquent as her hands. "When I found Ranger at the shelter, he was alone and afraid. People walked past him because he was different, because he couldn't hear them call. But I knew what that felt like, and I knew he was special." Her small hands moved in graceful patterns that even those who didn't understand sign language could recognize as deeply meaningful. "Now I know Ranger knew my dad. They were soldiers together. And when my dad couldn't come home to me, Ranger found me instead. He keeps his promises, he protects me, he teaches me to be brave." There wasn't a dry eye in the hall as Emily concluded, "Some people say dogs can't really love people. Those people have never met Ranger. And some people say deaf people miss too much of the world. Those people have never seen the world through our eyes. Sometimes the most important things don't make any sound at all." The standing ovation that followed needed no translation. Emily beamed as people rose to their feet, the visual impact of their appreciation more powerful than any applause could have been. Ranger remained steadfast beside her, his attention never wavering from his charge even amid the commotion. Afterward, at the reception, Margaret found herself approached by veterans eager to share stories of the working dogs they had known in service. Each tale reinforced what she had come to understand, that the bond between handlers and their dogs transcended typical human-animal relationships, creating connections as profound as any between human comrades. Colonel Bennett joined her as the crowd began to disperse, Emily and Ranger surrounded by admirers across the room. "Your granddaughter has quite a future ahead of her," he observed. "That kind of poise and eloquence is rare at any age." "She's her father's daughter," Margaret replied, watching as Emily demonstrated a series of signs to an attentive group of children. Ranger sat beside her, his posture relaxed but vigilant, always aware of his surroundings even in moments of apparent rest. "Captain Richardson would be proud," Bennett agreed. "Of both of them." As they prepared to leave, Harold Jenkins approached with an unexpected request. "The neighborhood association would like to install a small plaque in the community park," he explained. Honoring Ranger's service and recognizing him as Oakwood's first official canine resident. Margaret was momentarily speechless at this gesture from the man who had once tried to remove Ranger from their community. "That's very thoughtful, Harold. I'm sure Emily would be delighted." Jenkins nodded, his usual stiffness softened by genuine emotion. "We've been thinking about establishing a program, bringing veterans and service dogs to visit our local schools, teaching the children about sacrifice and service. If Emily and Ranger might consider participating occasionally." "I think they'd both enjoy that very much," Margaret replied, touched by how far they had all come from those first contentious encounters. The drive home was quiet, Emily dozing in the back seat beside Ranger, the events of the day having finally exhausted even her boundless energy. The shepherd remained alert, his amber eyes catching the streetlights as they passed, his body positioned protectively beside the sleeping child. At home, as Emily prepared for bed, she signed a question that caught Margaret by surprise. "Do you think Dad knows about Ranger finding me?" It was a question that touched on faith, on things unseen and unprovable, on the mysteries that had brought a military dog with a connection to Thomas into their lives against all odds. Margaret considered her answer carefully, wanting to honor both truth and hope. "I believe," she signed back, "that love finds ways to reach us even when it seems impossible. So yes, I think your father knows. I think he's very happy that you and Ranger found each other." Emily nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Tomorrow I'm going to teach Ranger 3 new signs," she signed, already planning ahead. "And Mrs. Santos said I can give a presentation about military dogs to the whole school next month." Margaret smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. "That sounds wonderful. Now get some sleep. Ranger needs his rest too." Later, after Emily had fallen asleep, Margaret stood in the doorway watching the familiar scene. The child, peaceful in slumber, the shepherd at his customary post beside her bed. Ranger's eyes met Margaret's across the darkened room, his gaze conveying what seemed like understanding, perhaps even gratitude. "You're welcome," Margaret whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her words. "Thank you for finding your way to us." Outside, spring rain began to fall gently, washing away the last vestiges of winter. In her bedroom, Emily slept soundly, free from the nightmares that had once plagued her. Beside her, Ranger maintained his vigilant watch, a silent guardian whose presence spoke volumes about loyalty, healing, and the invisible connections that bind us to one another. And in the quiet of the night, Margaret could almost believe that somewhere Thomas was watching over them all. Dear friends, some stories touch our hearts because they remind us what truly matters in life. Emily and Ranger's journey speaks to those of us who've experienced loss, who understand that second chances often arrive in unexpected packages. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, Margaret faced her challenges with quiet dignity, raising her granddaughter after losing her son, standing up against seemingly insurmountable odds, and recognizing that family takes many forms. Perhaps you too have found that the most profound connections often transcend words, happening in the silent spaces between heartbeats. Maybe you've discovered, as Margaret did, that our greatest strength emerges when protecting those we love. Ranger's story reminds us that our usefulness doesn't end with retirement or when our bodies begin to fail. That there's always purpose to be found, always someone who needs exactly what we have to offer. What unexpected blessings have appeared in your life disguised as challenges? Have you ever formed a bond with someone, human or animal, that seemed somehow destined, as if arranged by loved ones watching over you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because like Emily taught us, sometimes the most important things don't make any sound at all.